Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The Arizona night stretched endlessly in every direction. A vast expanse of darkness punctuated only by the occasional distant lights of scattered homesteads and the relentless sweep of Eldridge Poe's headlights across the weathered asphalt. The Interstate 40 corridor between Flagstaff and Kingman was familiar territory for him, a route he'd driven countless times over his 18 years as a long-haul trucker. The digital clock on his dashboard read 2:47 a.m., as his Kenworth T680 hummed steadily westward, its refrigerated trailer carrying a load of pharmaceuticals destined for distribution centers in California. At 53 years old, Eldridge had developed the particular rhythm that all veteran night drivers eventually find, that careful balance between alertness and the meditative calm required to endure hours of solitude on empty highways. His CB radio crackled occasionally with the distant chatter of other truckers, their voices providing sporadic companionship in the isolation of the desert night. The commercial radio stations out of Flagstaff had faded to static about 40 minutes earlier, their signals unable to penetrate the vast distances and geological formations that characterize this section of Arizona. Eldridge had cycled through the AM band, finding only the usual late-night offerings, a few evangelical programs broadcasting from distant cities, some Spanish-language stations, and the occasional burst of right-wing talk radio. He'd settled on a station that seemed to be playing classic country music, the kind of older recordings that reminded him of his father's record collection back in Oklahoma. The signal wavered in and out, but it was better than the silence or the repetitive drone of his truck's engine. He'd been listening for perhaps 20 minutes when the programming changed abruptly. The music cut off mid-song, replaced by a smooth, cultured voice that seemed oddly out of place in the context of the rural station. "Good evening, night travelers. You're listening to Desert Frequency, your companion through the dark hours. This is Luther Cade, and I'll be with you until sunrise." The voice had an old-fashioned quality to it, like something from radio's golden age, each word carefully enunciated with a slight southern accent that suggested education and refinement. "We've got a special program tonight for those of you making your way across Arizona's highways. I'll be taking your calls, sharing your stories, keeping you company through these lonely hours. If you're out there on the road, feeling the weight of the darkness, give me a call. Let's talk about where you've been, where you're going, and what you've seen along the way." Eldridge adjusted the volume slightly, finding something compelling about the announcer's voice. Luther Cade spoke with the kind of measured cadence that suggested he had all the time in the world, never rushing his words, letting each sentence hang in the air before moving to the next. It was the sort of radio personality that seemed to belong to a different era when broadcasting was considered an art form rather than just background noise. The program continued with Cade discussing the history of various highways in the American Southwest, weaving together facts about Route 66, the construction of the interstate system, and anecdotes about the communities that had thrived and withered as traffic patterns changed over the decades. His knowledge seemed encyclopedic, touching on everything from the geology of the region to the Native American peoples who had traversed these routes long before any roads existed. After about 15 minutes of this historical narrative, Luther Cade announced he would be taking calls. "Our lines are open now," he said, his voice dropping to a more intimate register. "If you're listening out there in the darkness, if you've got a story to share or just need someone to talk to, the number is on your screen." Eldridge glanced at his radio display, but it showed only the station frequency, 91 FM, nothing about a phone number. He assumed it must be a regular feature of the program, something loyal listeners would already know. The first caller was a woman who identified herself only as a night shift nurse driving home from Flagstaff Regional Medical Center. She spoke about the strange isolation of working while the rest of the world slept, about seeing the city in its most vulnerable hours. Luther Cade listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions, creating a conversation that felt genuine rather than performative. When she mentioned taking Route 89 south toward Sedona, Cade's response made Eldridge's hands tighten slightly on the steering wheel. Route 89 is a beautiful drive, especially in the pre-dawn hours, Luther Cade said. Tell me, have you passed the junction with Forest Road 231 yet? There's a particular quality to the light in that area just before sunrise, the way it catches on the red rocks. Almost otherworldly. The caller confirmed she was approaching that exact area, expressing surprise at his specific knowledge of her route. Cade laughed gently. I know these roads well, my dear. Every curve, every landmark. I've spent more time on them than I care to calculate. You drive safely now, and watch for deer near mile marker 342. They've been active in that area lately. The call ended, and Luther Cade moved smoothly into playing a song, an old Hank Williams recording that emerged from the speakers with surprising clarity despite the wavering signal strength. Eldridge found himself increasingly focused on the radio program, his attention divided between the road ahead and the voice emanating from his speakers. There was something unusual about it, something he couldn't quite articulate. The specificity of Luther Cade's knowledge, the way he seemed to know exactly where his callers were located, the intimate familiarity with routes and conditions, it all felt slightly off-kilter, like a picture frame hanging at an imperceptible angle. When the song ended, Cade returned with another caller, this time a trucker who identified himself as driving eastbound on I-40. The man's voice had the gravelly quality of someone who'd spent decades breathing diesel fumes and cigarette smoke. He was hauling construction equipment from California to Albuquerque, running behind schedule due to a breakdown outside of Needles. As they talked, Luther Cade again demonstrated that unsettling specificity, asking about particular truck stops, mentioning specific exit numbers, even inquiring about the condition of certain rest areas. You'll want to fuel up at the Flying J outside of Holbrook, Cade suggested. Better prices there than waiting until you cross into New Mexico, and the coffee is drinkable, which can't be said for everywhere along this route. The trucker agreed enthusiastically, noting that was exactly where he planned to stop. What made Eldridge's scalp prickle was what came next. Before you go, friend, let me ask you something, Luther Cade said, his voice taking on a slightly different quality, more focused somehow. When you passed through the area around Two Guns, did you happen to notice anything unusual? Any vehicles pulled over? Any lights that didn't quite fit? The trucker thought for a moment before responding. Now that you mention it, yeah. There was a sedan, looked like maybe a Chrysler or something, pulled off on the shoulder near that old abandoned tourist trap. Had its hazards on, but I didn't see anyone around it. Struck me as odd, but you know how it is. You don't always want to stop for every stranded motorist out here. Luther Cade made a sound of acknowledgement, a soft that conveyed understanding. No, of course not. A lone trucker stopping for strangers in the middle of the night. That's a calculated risk, but I appreciate you mentioning it. That vehicle has been there for some time now, and it concerns me. Someone may need help, or it may be abandoned altogether. Either way, it's something the authorities should know about. He thanked the caller and wished him safe travels, then smoothly transitioned into another song, this time a Patsy Cline number that Eldridge's mother had loved. As the music played, Eldridge felt a growing unease that he couldn't quite justify. Everything about the radio program seemed normal on the surface, just a late-night DJ taking calls and playing music, providing companionship for insomniacs and night workers. But something underneath that surface felt wrong, like ice that looks solid but carries dangerous thin spots. The specific knowledge of routes and conditions could be explained, he told himself. A dedicated host might monitor traffic reports, check road cameras, use GPS data to track conditions in real time. The personal nature of the conversations, the way Luther Cade seemed to connect so easily with callers, that was just good radio technique. The skill of someone who understood how to make each listener feel seen and heard. Yet Eldridge couldn't shake the feeling that he was listening to something that wasn't quite what it presented itself to be. Like a photograph that's been subtly manipulated in ways that aren't immediately obvious but create a cumulative sense of wrongness. He checked his GPS, confirming his location. He was approximately 35 miles east of Seligman, making good time despite the late hour. The highway stretched empty in both directions, his headlights the only significant illumination in a landscape that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The music ended, and Luther Cade's voice returned, warm and inviting. We've got time for one more caller before I share some thoughts on the nature of night driving and what it reveals about ourselves. Who's out there? Who wants to share their journey? There was a brief moment of dead air, just the soft static that underlies all radio broadcasts, and then a new voice came through, male, younger, with an accent that suggested Mexican heritage. Yeah, hi, this is Vernal Pike. I'm driving a flatbed with steel beams, heading west on 40 toward Kingman. Eldridge's attention sharpened instantly. The name Vernal Pike was unusual enough to be memorable, and the route description matched his own almost exactly. He found himself listening more intently, wondering if he might see this other trucker's lights ahead or behind him, though the road remained empty as far as he could see. Vernal Pike, Luther Cade repeated, seeming to savor the name. That's quite a distinctive name. Family name, I presume? The caller confirmed it was, explaining his grandfather had been named after the town in Utah where his family had first settled after emigrating from Mexico. Luther Cade expressed interest in the story, asking questions about the family's history, their experiences crossing borders both geographical and cultural. It was the kind of conversation that could have happened on any number of radio programs, personal without being intrusive, interesting without being exploitative. But then the tone shifted again, that subtle change that Eldridge was beginning to recognize as a signature of this broadcast. Tell me, Vernal, where exactly are you right now? What mile marker just passed? Vernal Pike responded after a brief pause, presumably checking his GPS or the roadside markers. I'm coming up on mile marker 139, should be there in about 30 seconds. Eldridge felt his breath catch. According to his own GPS, he was approaching mile marker 141, just 2 miles ahead of where this caller claimed to be. He immediately began scanning his mirrors more carefully, looking for the distinctive lights of another semi-truck behind him. The highway remained empty, no lights visible in either direction except his own. Mile marker 139, Luther Cade repeated thoughtfully. That puts you very close to the turnoff for the old Route 66 alignment, the section that runs parallel to the interstate for about 8 miles before rejoining the main highway. Beautiful piece of road, especially at night. Very little traffic, just you in the desert and the stars. Vernal Pike agreed, noting he'd driven that section before and enjoyed the solitude it offered. Luther Cade continued, his voice taking on a storytelling quality. There's a particular spot along that stretch about 4 miles in, where the old road passes through a small canyon. The rock formations create interesting acoustic effects. Sound behaves strangely there. Indigenous peoples considered it a sacred space, Somewhere the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds grew thin. Even today, people report unusual experiences in that area, feelings of being watched, moments where time seems to slip or stretch in uncomfortable ways. Eldridge kept checking his mirrors, increasingly troubled by the absence of any vehicle where one should be. If Vernal Pike was truly just 2 miles behind him on the same highway, his lights should be visible by now, even at a distance. Modern semi-trucks have bright, distinctive lighting, and on a clear night in the desert, visibility extends for miles. Yet the road behind him remained completely dark. No trace of another vehicle. The conversation between Luther Cade and the caller continued, becoming increasingly specific about locations and conditions along the route. Cade mentioned particular curves, warned about rough patches of pavement, even referenced a dead animal near a specific culvert that drivers should watch for. Each detail suggested intimate current knowledge of the highway, the kind of information that could only come from someone either physically present on the road or monitoring it through extensive technological means. Then Luther Cade said something that made Eldridge's skin crawl. "Vernal, I want you to do something for me. In about 3 miles, you're going to see a small crossroads, barely marked, easy to miss if you're not looking for it. There's an old wooden sign, weathered, nearly illegible, pointing south toward a place called Devil's Canyon. When you reach that intersection, I want you to slow down and look carefully at the roadside on your right. Tell me what you see there." The caller agreed, sounding slightly puzzled by the request but willing to comply. Eldridge did quick mental calculations. If he was currently at mile marker 141 and the caller was at 139, and this mysterious crossroads was 3 miles ahead of the caller, that would put it at approximately mile marker 142, which meant Eldridge himself should be reaching it very soon. He leaned forward slightly, peering into the darkness beyond his headlights, watching for any sign of the intersection Luther Cade had described. The highway continued to roll out before him, unchanging desert landscape punctuated by the occasional Joshua tree or boulder formation. His headlights swept across the familiar features of this route he'd driven so many times before, and then, suddenly, there it was, exactly as described. A small crossroads, barely more than a dirt track intersecting the highway, marked by an ancient wooden sign that his lights caught for just a moment. The words were indeed nearly illegible, worn by decades of sun and wind, but he could just make out Devil's Canyon and an arrow pointing south into the darkness. Eldridge felt his heart rate increase, a primal response to something his conscious mind hadn't quite processed yet. He was reaching this location now, which meant if the caller was truly 3 miles behind him, he wouldn't arrive for several more minutes. Yet Luther Cade had described it as if he knew Vernal Pike was about to encounter it imminently. The timing didn't make sense unless one of several disturbing possibilities was true. Either the caller had lied about his location, or Cade had made an error in his calculations, or something far stranger was happening. Eldridge slowed his truck slightly, an instinctive response to uncertainty, and as he passed the intersection he looked carefully to his right, following the same instruction Luther Cade had given to the caller. What he saw made him press harder on the brake, bringing his rig down to 40 miles per hour as his mind tried to process what his eyes were reporting. There, just off the shoulder, barely illuminated by his running lights, was a vehicle. Not a car or a pickup truck, but a semi-truck, a flatbed, pulled partially off the road at an awkward angle. Even from this brief glimpse as he passed, Eldridge could see something was wrong with it. The truck appeared damaged, its front end crumpled as if it had struck something with considerable force. More disturbing was the cargo, steel beams, just as the caller Vernal Pike had described carrying, scattered and twisted, some still strapped to the flatbed, others thrown clear in what must have been a violent collision. Eldridge's foot moved toward the brake pedal, every instinct telling him to stop, to check for survivors, to call for help. But something held him back, a warning that operated below conscious thought. Instead, he grabbed his CB radio, switching to channel 19, the standard frequency truckers monitored. "Breaker, breaker, this is Eldridge Poe, westbound on I-40 approaching mile marker 143. I've got what looks like an accident scene, semi-truck with steel beams off the shoulder near a crossroads. Requesting any available units to verify and assist. Over." The CB crackled with static, but no immediate response came. Highway Patrol monitored this channel periodically, but at this hour, in this remote section, response times could be unpredictable. Eldridge accelerated back to highway speed, his mind racing, trying to make sense of what he'd seen and what he was hearing on his radio. Because, through his FM speakers, Luther Cade's voice continued smoothly, still conversing with Vernal Pike, still discussing the crossroads and what might be seen there. And the caller, Vernal Pike, was now describing seeing the intersection, seeing the old weathered sign, and his voice changing to something between confusion and horror, seeing something else at the roadside. There's a truck here," Vernal Pike said, his earlier casual tone completely gone. "It's wrecked, looks bad, I can see. Jesus, Luther, I can see someone in the cab. I need to stop, I need to call this in." Luther Cade's response came without hesitation, his voice maintaining its calm, measured quality despite the caller's obvious distress. "No, Vernal, I need you to keep driving. Don't stop there. That scene is already being handled. Help is on the way. The best thing you can do is keep moving and report what you've seen to authorities at your next stop." The caller protested, invoking both moral obligation and federal regulations that required commercial drivers to render aid at accident scenes. But Luther Cade was insistent, his voice taking on a quality that was simultaneously reassuring and commanding. "Listen to me very carefully, Vernal. The situation at that location is more complicated than it appears. There are already responders en route. If you stop, you'll only complicate matters, possibly put yourself in danger. I know this seems wrong. I know every instinct is telling you to help, but you need to trust me on this. Keep driving." The conversation continued for another minute, Luther Cade somehow persuading the reluctant caller to continue westward, promising to personally ensure that proper authorities were notified, that help would reach the accident scene. Finally, Vernal Pike agreed, though his voice carried doubt and guilt. "All right, Luther, I'm trusting you on this. But if I find out later that someone died because I didn't stop, you have my word." Luther Cade interrupted gently. "Everything that can be done will be done. Now, let's talk about something else for a moment. Tell me about your destination, what you're carrying that load of steel beams for." Eldridge's hands were shaking slightly on the steering wheel. He'd just passed that exact accident scene, seen the same wrecked flatbed with its scattered cargo, and now he was listening to a caller describe seeing it as if it was happening in real time, despite the physical impossibility of the situation. If the caller was truly behind him, where Eldridge could not see any following lights, and was just now reaching the crossroads that Eldridge had already passed, then the laws of space and time were being violated in ways that defied rational explanation. He grabbed his CB radio again, this time broadcasting on multiple channels, trying to reach any other truckers in the area. "This is Eldridge Poe, westbound on I-40 between Seligman and Kingman. Is there anyone else listening to FM 91.7? Anyone else hearing Luther Cade's program? I need someone to confirm I'm not losing my mind here. Over." Static answered him, the empty hiss of radio waves carrying no human voice. He tried again, switching frequencies, broadcasting blind into the Arizona night, hoping someone, anyone, would respond and provide some rational explanation for what he was experiencing. But the CB remained silent, except for his own transmissions echoing back at him, a lonely sound that emphasized rather than alleviated his isolation. On the FM radio, Luther Cade had moved on to playing another song, a melancholy Johnny Cash ballad about lost highways and wandering souls. Eldridge reached for the radio controls, his fingers hovering over the tuning knob. Every logical impulse told him to change the station, to find something normal and mundane, to distance himself from whatever strange broadcast he'd stumbled into. Yet he found himself unable to turn the dial, compelled by a terrible curiosity to continue listening, to hear what would come next. The song faded, and Luther Cade's voice returned, now addressing his audience in general rather than speaking to a specific caller. We're approaching that hour of the night when the darkness is deepest, when dawn seems impossibly distant, when the mind begins to play tricks and the boundaries between memory and experience blur. This is when the road reveals its truths, when we see things as they truly are rather than as we pretend them to be during the safer hours of daylight. His voice had changed subtly, becoming more philosophical, more portentous. I wonder sometimes how many people are out there right now, driving these highways, believing themselves alone, unobserved, just another vehicle passing through the darkness, not realizing that every mile marker, every curve, every decision is being noted, recorded, becoming part of a larger pattern that none of us can fully perceive. Eldridge felt cold despite the warmth of his truck's cabin. Luther Cade's words seemed directed at him specifically, though he knew rationally that was impossible. The broadcast was going out to potentially thousands of listeners across Arizona and possibly beyond, depending on the station's range. Yet the uncanny specificity of recent events, the impossible conversation with Vernal Pike, the precise description of the accident scene, all of it suggested something far more targeted than random radio programming. He checked his GPS again, noting he was now approaching exit 123, the turnoff for a small community called Peach Springs. The exit was primarily used by locals and the occasional tourist visiting the Havasupai Falls or exploring Route 66 nostalgia sites. At this hour, it would be completely deserted, just another pool of darkness off the main highway. Luther Cade's voice continued its philosophical musing, and then he said something that made Eldridge's blood run cold. I'm seeing now that we have another listener who's been particularly attentive tonight. Someone who's been puzzling over our conversation, trying to make sense of things that don't quite add up. Someone approaching exit 123 right about now, wondering whether to keep driving or to pull off and take a moment to collect his thoughts. Eldridge's foot instinctively moved toward the brake pedal again, his body responding to the shock before his mind could catch up. Luther Cade was describing him, his exact location, his internal mental state. This wasn't coincidence or lucky guessing. This was direct, specific, impossible knowledge. Eldridge, Luther Cade said, speaking his name for the first time, his voice intimate and oddly gentle. I know you're frightened. I know nothing about this night makes sense, but I need you to keep listening. There are things you need to understand about the road you're traveling, about why you've been chosen to hear this particular broadcast. The highway stretched empty ahead of him, and in his mirrors, still no sign of any other vehicle despite the caller who should have been there. Eldridge's rational mind was screaming at him to turn off the radio, to call his dispatcher, to pull over at the next truck stop and wait for daylight. But Luther Cade's voice held him, kept him listening, kept him driving into the darkness that suddenly felt much less empty than it had before. Eldridge's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The physical pain a minor distraction from the impossibility of what he was experiencing. Luther Cade had spoken his name, known his exact location, described his internal state with an accuracy that suggested either technological surveillance far beyond anything Eldridge understood, or something even more disturbing. The radio continued to emit that smooth, cultured voice, now addressing him as if they were the only two people in the world, as if the broadcast itself had narrowed to a private conversation conducted across the electromagnetic spectrum. "You're wondering how I know you, Eldridge. You're running through possibilities in your mind, trying to find a rational explanation. GPS tracking, perhaps. Company monitoring systems. Maybe you think your dispatcher has shared information with someone, that this is all some elaborate practical joke being played on a tired driver in the middle of the night." Luther Cade paused, and in that silence, Eldridge could hear his own breathing, harsh and rapid in the quiet cab of his truck. "But you don't really believe any of those explanations, do you? Because they don't account for what you saw at that crossroads. They don't explain the caller who described an accident scene at a location he couldn't possibly have reached yet, if he exists at all." Eldridge forced himself to take several slow, deliberate breaths, trying to impose order on his spiraling thoughts. He'd been driving professionally for 18 years, had logged over 2 million miles across every state in the continental United States and parts of Canada. He'd driven through blizzards that reduced visibility to mere feet, navigated mountain passes in conditions that would terrify most people, handled equipment failures and near misses with drunk drivers and suicidal deer. He'd always prided himself on being unflappable, someone who could maintain composure and make sound decisions under pressure. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for the fundamental wrongness of this situation, the way reality itself seemed to be malfunctioning around him. "I'm going to tell you a story, Eldridge," Luther Cade continued, his voice maintaining that same measured cadence that made it impossible to tell if he was reading from a script or speaking extemporaneously. "It's about this highway you're traveling, about the stretch of Interstate 40 between Flagstaff and Kingman. Most people think of roads as simple things, ribbons of asphalt connecting point A to point B, purely functional infrastructure designed to facilitate commerce and travel. But highways are more complex than that. They're layers of history, built on top of older roads, which were built on top of ancient trails, which followed paths worn by animals, which followed the contours of the land itself. Every highway carries the memory of everything that came before it." Eldridge wanted to turn the radio off, to silence that voice and drive in blessed quiet until he reached Kingman, where he could pull into a brightly lit truck stop filled with other people in normal conversation. But his hand refused to obey, hovering over the controls without making contact, as if some part of him recognized that turning off the radio wouldn't actually end the broadcast, wouldn't sever whatever connection had been established between himself and Luther Cade. The highway continued to unspool before him, mile after mile of unchanging desert landscape, and he realized with growing unease that he hadn't seen another vehicle in either direction for over 20 minutes. For a major interstate corridor, even at this late hour, that degree of isolation was unusual, bordering on impossible. "This particular section of highway has what you might call a complicated history," Luther Cade said, shifting into what sounded like lecture mode, the kind of educational broadcast that might air on public radio during more conventional hours. When they were surveying the route for Interstate 40 back in the late 1950s, the engineers encountered numerous obstacles. The terrain was challenging, certainly, but there were other complications. Several of the proposed routes crossed areas that local indigenous peoples insisted were spiritually significant, places where the natural world intersected with something they couldn't or wouldn't explain to the white men with their surveying equipment and blueprints. Eldridge checked his mirrors again, a compulsive gesture that had become almost rhythmic. The road behind him remained empty, no lights visible despite the excellent visibility. He thought about the wrecked flatbed he'd passed, about the caller Vernal Pike who had described seeing the same scene. Had that accident been real? Was there someone injured or dying back there while he continued to drive away? But if it was real, why hadn't his CB radio calls received any response? Why hadn't he seen any emergency vehicles responding to the scene? The questions multiplied faster than he could process them, creating a mounting anxiety that made it difficult to focus on the simple task of keeping his truck in its lane. The engineers, being practical men concerned with grades and drainage and cost efficiency, naturally ignored these warnings, Luther Cade continued. They built the highway where their calculations suggested it should go, blasting through rock formations, filling in washes, imposing their straight lines and gentle curves on a landscape that had its own geometry, its own logic, and, for the most part, it worked. Tens of thousands of vehicles travel this highway every day, moving goods and people across the desert without incident or concern. But there are anomalies, Eldridge. There are nights when the highway remembers what it was built on top of, when the boundary between what is and what was becomes permeable. The philosophical nature of Luther Cade's monologue should have been boring, the kind of abstract rambling that makes listeners change stations or turn off the radio entirely. But something about his delivery, the absolute certainty in his voice, made it compelling in a way Eldridge couldn't explain. He found himself listening intently, following the logic even as part of his mind screamed that this was all nonsense, that he was being manipulated by someone with unclear motives and possibly dangerous intentions. His GPS showed him approaching mile marker 115, which meant he was roughly halfway between Seligman and Kingman, in one of the most remote and isolated sections of this route. The nearest town of any size was at least 30 miles in either direction, and even those were barely more than clusters of gas stations and fast food restaurants serving highway travelers. There was an accident here in 1967, Luther Cade said, his tone shifting from philosophical to narrative. A family from Illinois driving cross-country in a station wagon loaded with camping equipment and optimistic plans for a summer vacation. The father had been driving for too many hours, fighting sleep, determined to make it to Kingman before stopping for the night. It was approximately 3:15 a.m. when he drifted across the center line on a gentle curve and collided head-on with a semi-truck hauling agricultural equipment. The impact killed him instantly, along with his wife in the passenger seat. Their 3 children in the back seat survived initially, trapped in the wreckage, calling for help that didn't come for over 40 minutes because this was before the era of cell phones and emergency response systems. Eldridge felt a chill run down his spine, despite the warmth of his truck's cabin. He knew these kinds of stories, had heard variations of them at truck stops and rest areas, the oral history of the highways shared among drivers like folklore. Every route had its ghost stories, its legendary accidents and mysterious disappearances. But the way Luther Cade told this particular story with such specific detail and an undercurrent of personal knowledge suggested something beyond mere legend. The radio signal wavered slightly, creating brief moments of static that made Cade's voice sound distant and strange before clarifying again. Eldridge checked his fuel gauge, noting he had just over a quarter tank remaining, enough to reach Kingman comfortably but not enough to deviate significantly from his route if he decided to exit the highway and seek help. The semi-truck driver survived the accident, Luther Cade continued, though he was severely injured. His name was Harold Weems, a 48-year-old veteran trucker from Missouri, making his regular run between California and Texas. The investigation determined he bore no legal responsibility for the accident, that the station wagon had crossed into his lane and given him no time to react. But legal exoneration doesn't always translate to psychological peace, Eldridge. Harold Weems spent the remaining 17 years of his life haunted by what happened that night, by the sound of those children calling for help, by the knowledge that even though the accident wasn't his fault, his truck had been the instrument of death for 2 people and permanent trauma for 3 others. The story was affecting Eldridge in ways he didn't want to acknowledge. Every professional driver lived with the awareness that their vehicle, through mechanical failure or another driver's mistake or simple bad luck, could become a weapon weighing tens of thousands of pounds, capable of causing catastrophic damage in fractions of a second. It was a responsibility that sat somewhere in the back of every trucker's mind, informing decisions about speed and following distance and when to pull over for rest. Hearing Luther Cade describe it so explicitly, making it the center of his narrative, felt like having an unspoken fear dragged into the light and examined in uncomfortable detail. Harold Weems continued driving for 3 more years after the accident, Luther Cade said. But something had changed in him. Other truckers who knew him reported that he became obsessed with helping stranded motorists, would go out of his way to stop and render assistance even when it meant falling behind schedule. He installed extra emergency equipment in his truck, carried first aid supplies far beyond what regulations required, monitored his CB radio, constantly listening for distress calls. It was as if he was trying to balance some cosmic ledger, to somehow compensate for the deaths he'd been involved in by preventing other tragedies. Eldridge found himself checking his mirrors yet again, an almost automatic gesture now. The road remained empty, but he noticed something else that made his unease deepen. The stars, which had been brilliantly clear earlier in the night, now seemed dimmer, as if a thin haze had formed in the upper atmosphere. But the air quality appeared fine. No signs of smoke or dust that might explain the change. It was subtle enough that he questioned whether he was really seeing it or if his stressed mind was imposing patterns on random phenomena. Luther Cade's voice continued without pause, weaving his story with the skill of someone who'd told it many times before or perhaps never stopped telling it. In 1970, 3 years after the accident, Harold Weems was driving this exact stretch of highway, westbound like you are now, Eldridge, during the early morning hours. He reported via CB radio that he was passing the area where his accident had occurred, mile marker 117, just a few miles ahead of where you are right now. Other truckers monitoring the channel heard him describe seeing something at the roadside, a station wagon that looked identical to the one from his accident, pulled over with its hazard lights flashing. He said he was going to stop and check on it, to see if anyone needed assistance. The story was heading somewhere Eldridge didn't want to follow, but he found himself unable to stop listening. Luther Cade's voice had become almost hypnotic, its rhythm perfectly calibrated to hold attention while simultaneously creating a mounting sense of dread. The highway continued to flow past, unchanging desert landscape illuminated by his headlights, and Eldridge realized he'd unconsciously increased his speed, now traveling at nearly 75 miles per hour, as if some instinct was urging him to cover this ground as quickly as possible to get through whatever zone he'd entered. Harold Weems pulled over behind the station wagon. Luther Cade continued. He activated his hazard lights, grabbed his flashlight and first aid kit, and approached the vehicle. What happened next, we only know from the recordings of his CB radio transmissions, which were later recovered and analyzed. He reported that the station wagon appeared to be empty, no one visible in the front or back seats, though the engine was running and the lights were on. He called out, identifying himself as someone who wanted to help, receiving no response. Then his transmission cut off abruptly, mid-sentence, replaced by static. Eldridge's GPS showed mile marker 116, which meant he was approaching the location Luther Cade was describing. He found himself easing off the accelerator slightly, torn between a desire to speed past this area as quickly as possible and a morbid need to see if there was anything there, any physical evidence of the stories he was hearing. The highway remained empty in both directions. No other vehicles visible despite this being a major interstate corridor. That wrongness, that impossible isolation, had become so pronounced that Eldridge could no longer rationalize it away. Something was fundamentally different about this night, about this drive, about the space he was moving through. Search parties found Harold Weems's truck the following morning, Luther Cade said, his voice dropping to a more somber register. It was pulled over on the shoulder near mile marker 117, hazard lights still flashing, engine still running. The driver's door was open, his flashlight lying on the pavement, its beam still illuminating the empty desert. But Harold Weems himself was never found. Extensive searches of the surrounding area, including helicopters and tracking dogs, found no trace of him. It was as if he'd simply ceased to exist the moment he stepped away from his truck. The case remains officially unsolved, classified as a missing person incident with suspicious circumstances. The mile marker for 117 appeared in Eldridge's headlights, the reflective numbers bright against the darkness. He scanned the shoulder on both sides of the highway, looking for any vehicle, any sign of human presence. The desert stretched away in all directions, empty and vast under the dimmed stars. Nothing appeared out of place. No station wagon with hazard lights, no abandoned semi-truck. Nothing to indicate this was anything other than another unremarkable mile of interstate highway. Yet Eldridge felt a profound reluctance to simply drive past, as if doing so would be tempting fate in some way he couldn't articulate. He kept his speed steady, his eyes moving constantly between the road ahead and his mirrors, hyper-alert for any change in his environment. "You're wondering why I'm telling you this story, Eldridge," Luther Cade said, and once again his words seemed to respond directly to Eldridge's thoughts, creating that disturbing sense of being observed from the inside out. "You're wondering what connection it has to your current situation, to the wrecked flatbed you passed earlier, to the caller who described seeing it. Here's what I need you to understand. This highway doesn't exist solely in the present moment. It carries echoes of everything that's happened on it. And on certain nights, under particular conditions, those echoes become loud enough to hear, clear enough to see. You're experiencing temporal overlap, Eldridge. You're not just driving through space, you're driving through time, or rather, through multiple times simultaneously." The explanation should have been absurd, the kind of pseudo-scientific nonsense that Eldridge would normally dismiss without a second thought. But given everything he'd experienced over the past hour, it resonated with a terrible plausibility. The impossible conversation with Vernal Pike, who had described an accident scene before reaching it. The complete absence of other traffic on a major highway. The way Luther Cade seemed to know things he couldn't possibly know through conventional means. All of it suggested that normal rules weren't applying tonight, that he'd somehow slipped into a version of reality that operated according to different principles. "The wrecked flatbed you saw," Luther Cade said, "that was Vernal Pike's truck. Or rather, it will be. Or perhaps it already was, depending on which temporal framework you're using. He's driving toward that accident right now, or he drove toward it years ago, or he'll drive toward it in the future. On this highway, on nights like this, those distinctions become meaningless. The accident has happened, is happening, will happen, all simultaneously." Eldridge felt his breathing become shallow, his chest tight with an anxiety that went beyond normal fear. If what Luther Cade was saying had any truth to it, if he was somehow experiencing multiple time frames at once, then what did that mean for his own safety? Was he seeing his own future? Was he watching events that had already claimed him without his knowledge? "I can hear your fear, Eldridge, and I understand it," Luther Cade said, his voice taking on a tone that was almost compassionate. "But you need to stay calm and keep driving. You need to get through this section of highway before the overlap becomes complete. Right now, you're in a transitional zone, experiencing fragments of different times, but you're still anchored primarily to your present moment. If you stop, if you pull over or try to turn around, you risk becoming permanently displaced, stuck in one of these other temporal frames, unable to return to your own time. The wrecked flatbed, Harold Weems' abandoned truck, the station wagon from 1967, they're all markers of moments when people became untethered. The practical part of Eldridge's mind that still functioned was screaming at him to do exactly what Luther Cade was warning against, to pull over, to stop this insane drive through increasingly surreal circumstances, to call for help and wait for someone sane and reliable to arrive. But another part, the part that had been listening to Luther Cade's impossible knowledge and increasingly strange explanations, recognized that conventional help wasn't coming. The empty highway, the absence of any response to his CB transmissions, the dimming stars, all of it indicated he was already beyond the reach of normal emergency services. If he was going to get through this, it would be on Luther Cade's terms, following instructions from a radio host who might be human or might be something else entirely. "You're approaching mile marker 112 now," Luther Cade said, and Eldridge glanced at his GPS to confirm the accuracy. "In approximately 3 miles, you'll reach an area where there was a rock slide in 1989 that closed the highway for 2 days. The debris was cleared, the slope stabilized, the road repaired. But on nights like this, the highway remembers its damaged state, and you might see or feel things that reflect that reality. Your truck might seem to be driving over rough, debris-covered pavement, even though your eyes tell you the road is smooth. Don't let it confuse you. Don't try to compensate for something that isn't really there. Just maintain your speed and trajectory. Trust your instruments more than your senses." Eldridge wanted to argue, to demand clearer explanations, to insist that he deserved to understand what was happening to him and why he'd been chosen for this experience. But the words wouldn't come, his throat tight with suppressed fear and confusion. He gripped the steering wheel and kept driving, watching the mile markers count down, approaching the area Luther Cade had described. The highway looked normal, the same smooth asphalt he'd been traveling on for the past hour, but as he reached mile marker 111, he felt his truck's suspension react as if passing over rough terrain, violent jolts that should have been accompanied by the sound of debris striking his undercarriage but produced only normal road noise. His eyes insisted the pavement was smooth, that nothing was there to cause such movement, but his body felt every impact, every swerve his truck made to avoid obstacles that weren't visible. The disconnect between visual input and physical sensation was nauseating, making it difficult to maintain his lane, to judge distances correctly. He heard his cargo shift slightly in the trailer, the pharmaceuticals he was hauling responding to motion that simultaneously did and didn't exist. For perhaps 30 seconds that felt like hours, he drove through this zone of conflicting realities, every instinct screaming confusion, until suddenly it passed and the highway felt normal again, his truck settling back into its smooth forward motion. "You did well, Eldridge," Luther Cade said, approval evident in his voice. "You trusted the process and kept driving. Not everyone manages that. Some people panic, try to stop or turn around, and they become stuck in the overlap, permanently displaced into whichever temporal frame was strongest at that moment. You're still anchored to your own time, still moving forward through space and time in relatively normal fashion. But you're not out of this yet. There are more transitions ahead, more moments where past and present and future will bleed into each other. You need to stay alert and keep driving." Eldridge's hands were shaking now, fine tremors he couldn't control. He pressed harder on the accelerator, bringing his speed up to 80 miles per hour, faster than was strictly safe or legal, but driven by a desperate need to cover ground, to get through whatever zone he'd entered and back to normal reality. His GPS showed he was still approximately 40 miles from Kingman, 40 miles of highway that now felt infinitely long, stretching into forever, each mile marker a small victory that brought him no closer to genuine safety. Luther Cade's voice continued, steady and inexorable, guiding him through an experience that defied every rational category Eldridge had for understanding the world. "There's something else you need to know," Luther Cade said, and his tone shifted again, becoming more serious, more urgent. "The reason you're experiencing this, the reason you can hear my broadcast and perceive these temporal overlaps, is because you're about to become one of the markers yourself. Approximately 15 miles ahead of your current position, at mile marker 97, there's an event waiting to happen. An accident involving your truck, caused by circumstances you can't yet see or predict. In your timeline, in the normal flow of cause and effect, you're going to lose control of your vehicle and crash, causing significant damage and potentially fatal injuries." The words hit Eldridge like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his vision narrow to a tunnel focused on the highway ahead. He was going to die. Luther Cade was telling him, with that same calm, measured voice he'd used for everything else, that death was waiting for him just 15 miles down the road. Every instinct screamed at him to stop, to refuse to drive any further toward a prophesied end. But Luther Cade wasn't finished speaking. "But here's the crucial detail, Eldridge. I'm telling you this precisely because it doesn't have to happen. The fact that you're hearing my broadcast, the fact that you can perceive these temporal overlaps, means you're in a position to change the outcome. You can avoid the accident that's waiting for you, but only if you follow my instructions exactly. Only if you trust me completely and do precisely what I tell you when the moment comes. Do you understand? Your death is both fixed and mutable, both inevitable and avoidable. Which version becomes real depends entirely on your choices in the next 15 miles. Eldridge found his voice, hoarse and strained. How? How do I avoid it? What am I supposed to do? But even as he spoke, he realized Luther Cade couldn't hear him, that this broadcast was one-directional despite how much it felt like a conversation. The radio was receiving only, not transmitting, and all of Luther Cade's apparent responses to Eldridge's thoughts were something else entirely, prediction or precognition or access to information through means Eldridge couldn't comprehend. He was alone in his truck, listening to a voice that knew his fate, hoping it would provide enough guidance to change that fate before the highway claimed him the way it had claimed so many others. "Keep driving, Eldridge," Luther Cade said, his voice taking on an almost gentle quality. "Keep driving and keep listening. The next 15 miles will determine everything." The mile markers continued their steady countdown as Eldridge pushed his Kenworth westward through the Arizona darkness, each illuminated sign simultaneously a measure of progress and a reminder of diminishing distance to the accident Luther Cade had prophesied. Mile marker 110 passed, then 109, then 108. The numbers ticking down toward 97, where his fate supposedly waited. His mind raced through scenarios trying to anticipate what kind of accident could be both predicted and avoided. What circumstances might cause him to lose control of a vehicle he'd been operating safely for nearly 2 decades? A tire blowout? Mechanical failure? An animal darting into his path? Each possibility seemed simultaneously plausible and insufficient to explain the certainty in Luther Cade's voice. The radio had fallen silent after Cade's ominous warning, playing another song, this time a haunting instrumental piece that Eldridge didn't recognize. All minor chords and unsettling progressions that seemed designed to heighten rather than alleviate tension. He found himself straining to hear any background sounds in the broadcast, anything that might provide context or clues about where Luther Cade was transmitting from, whether he was in a conventional radio station or somewhere else entirely. But the audio quality was too clean, too polished, revealing nothing except the music itself and occasional barely perceptible static that might have been atmospheric interference or might have been something else. At mile marker 105, Eldridge made a decision. He grabbed his CB radio and began broadcasting continuously, describing everything he was experiencing, creating an audio record that might survive even if he didn't. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, higher pitched than normal, tight with suppressed panic. "This is Eldridge Poe, westbound on I-40, approaching mile marker 105. If anyone is receiving this transmission, I need you to understand that something is happening on this highway tonight. I've been listening to a radio broadcast that knows things it shouldn't know, that's predicting an accident at mile marker 97. I don't know if I'm experiencing some kind of breakdown, if there's a gas leak in my cab affecting my thinking, or if something genuinely anomalous is occurring. But I'm documenting it. I'm creating a record. If this truck is found abandoned or damaged, someone needs to investigate FM station 91.7 and a host named Luther Cade." No response came through the CB speaker, just the empty hiss of an open channel with no one monitoring it. But Eldridge felt fractionally better having spoken the words aloud, having externalized the terror that had been building inside him since he first noticed the impossibilities of this night. He continued to broadcast periodically, updating his position, describing the empty highway and the dimmed stars and the feeling of wrongness that had settled over everything like a physical weight. It gave him something to focus on besides the shrinking distance to mile marker 97, a task that required attention and articulation, forcing his mind to work in structured ways rather than spinning into panic. Luther Cade's voice returned as Eldridge passed mile marker 102, cutting smoothly into the instrumental music. "You're doing well to document your experience, Eldridge, though I'm afraid your CB transmissions aren't reaching anyone who can help you. You're still in the overlap zone, existing partially outside your normal timeline, and communications don't always bridge those gaps the way we'd like. But the impulse is good, the instinct to bear witness, to ensure that what happens to you is recorded and understood. That instinct has saved more people than you might imagine, in situations far stranger than this one." Eldridge's jaw clenched at the confirmation that his attempts to reach other drivers were futile, that he was as isolated as the empty highway suggested. Luther Cade continued speaking, his tone taking on the quality of someone delivering instructions to a student, patient but insistent. "I'm going to tell you exactly what's going to happen at mile marker 97, and exactly what you need to do to avoid it. Listen carefully, Eldridge, because I won't be able to repeat this information. When you reach mile marker 98, exactly 1 mile before the accident point, you're going to see something in your headlights. It will appear to be a large piece of debris in your lane, perhaps a portion of a blown truck tire, or a section of wooden pallet, the kind of road hazard that drivers encounter regularly and must react to quickly." The specificity of the description made Eldridge's hands tighten on the steering wheel, his entire body tensing in preparation for the scenario Luther Cade was outlining. He checked his mirrors compulsively, verified his speed, made mental notes of his truck's current performance characteristics. Every instinct honed by years of professional driving was coming online, preparing for an emergency maneuver that hadn't yet occurred but felt terrifyingly imminent. Luther Cade's voice continued without pause, laying out the sequence of events with the precision of someone describing a historical occurrence rather than a future possibility. "Your natural instinct will be to swerve to avoid the debris," Cade said. "You'll see it directly in your path, and your training will tell you to move into the left lane to pass around it safely. This is what every competent driver would do, what you've done hundreds of times before when encountering obstacles on the highway. But Eldridge, in this specific instance, that instinct will kill you. Because the debris isn't real, or rather it's only real in one of the temporal frames you're overlapping with. In your timeline, your present moment, the road is clear. If you swerve to avoid something that doesn't exist in your physical reality, you'll overcorrect, lose control of your vehicle, and cross the median into oncoming traffic. The explanation sent ice through Eldridge's veins. He was being asked to drive directly at an obstacle, to override every trained response and instinct, to trust that his eyes would be lying to him when they reported danger in his path. The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. The conflict between self-preservation instincts and the instructions from a voice on a radio broadcast that might itself be a hallucination or manipulation. How could he possibly drive towards something that appeared solid and dangerous, gambling his life on the word of someone he'd never met, whose existence he couldn't even verify? "I know what I'm asking of you," Luther Cade said, and once again his words seemed to respond directly to Eldridge's internal struggle. "I know how impossible it seems to deliberately drive toward danger when every fiber of your being is screaming at you to take evasive action. But consider this. You've already experienced the disconnect between what you see and what's physically real. You drove through that section near mile marker 111, felt your truck bouncing over debris that your eyes insisted wasn't there. You have direct experience with the way these temporal overlaps create false perceptions. What I'm asking you to do is apply that understanding in a more active way, to choose to trust the version of reality that you can't see, rather than the one your senses are reporting. Mile marker 100 passed, and Eldridge realized he was now just 3 miles from the point where he would either prove Luther Cade right or die trying. His breathing had become shallow again, his heart rate elevated to the point where he could feel it pounding in his chest and hear it in his ears. He tried to imagine the scenario, visualized seeing debris in his headlights and forcing himself to maintain course, to drive through rather than around it. The mental exercise felt impossible, every simulation ending with him flinching away at the last moment, unable to override the fundamental survival programming that demands evasion of perceived threats. "There's something else you should know," Luther Cade said, his voice dropping to a more intimate register. "This isn't the first time we've had this conversation, Eldridge. Not for me, anyway. For you, this is your first experience of this night, your first time hearing my voice and receiving these warnings. But I've guided you through this moment before, in other iterations, other attempts to help you reach the correct outcome. Some of those iterations ended badly. In some versions, you didn't listen to the broadcast at all, never received the warning, and the accident occurred exactly as it was written in the original timeline. In other versions, you heard the warning but couldn't bring yourself to trust it, swerved anyway, and died in the resulting collision. The revelation added another layer of surreality to an already impossible situation. Luther Cade was claiming to exist outside normal time, to be aware of multiple versions of this night, each one playing out according to different choices and different outcomes. If that was true, then Eldridge was living through something far more complex than a simple premonition or warning. He was a participant in a process that transcended normal causality, his actions not just determining his own fate, but potentially affecting the structure of reality itself. The weight of that possibility was almost crushing, making it difficult to maintain focus on the immediate practical concerns of keeping his truck on the road. Mile marker 99 appeared in his headlights, bright and clear, and Eldridge felt his entire body tense like a spring being compressed. 1 mile. 1 mile until he would see the phantom debris and have to make an impossible choice. He found himself praying, something he hadn't done since childhood, half-formed pleas to a deity he wasn't sure he believed in, asking for guidance or protection, or simply the courage to do what needed to be done. His hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel, his shirt damp against his back despite the climate-controlled comfort of his cab. Every sense was hyper-alert, scanning the highway ahead for any sign of the obstacle Luther Cade had described. "When you see the debris, Eldridge, I need you to do several things simultaneously," Luther Cade instructed, his voice taking on the crisp authority of someone delivering emergency procedures. "First, maintain your speed. Don't accelerate and don't brake. Any change in your velocity will affect your trajectory and could cause the overcorrection even without a deliberate swerve. Second, keep your steering absolutely straight. Don't turn the wheel even a fraction of an inch. Your truck will want to drift slightly, every vehicle does, but resist the urge to correct. Third, and this is crucial, close your eyes just before impact with the debris. I know that sounds insane, but your visual cortex will be screaming danger signals that make it nearly impossible to maintain course. If you can't see the obstacle, you can't flinch away from it." The instructions were clear and specific, but following them would require a level of trust and discipline that Eldridge wasn't certain he possessed. Driving blind, even for the 2 or 3 seconds it would take to pass through the debris field, violated every principle of safe vehicle operation. Yet he understood the logic. His eyes would be the problem, the source of false information that would trigger instinctive responses. If he removed vision from the equation temporarily, he could rely on the other inputs, the feel of the road through his steering and suspension, the sound of his engine and tires, the simple physics of a vehicle moving forward at constant velocity on a straight path. Mile marker 98 appeared, and Eldridge's breath caught in his throat. This was it. The point of no return. Everything that had happened over the past hours had been building toward whatever would occur in the next 60 seconds. He straightened in his seat, adjusted his grip on the steering wheel to a position that would allow him to maintain steady pressure without overcorrecting, and consciously forced his muscles to relax slightly, knowing that attention would make him more likely to jerk the wheel instinctively. His eyes scanned the highway ahead with desperate intensity, searching for the debris that Luther Cade had promised would appear. For several seconds, nothing. The highway stretched empty and clear, well-maintained asphalt illuminated by his headlights, centerline and edge markers perfectly visible. Eldridge began to wonder if Luther Cade had been wrong, if the prophesied obstacle wasn't going to materialize, if this entire experience had been some kind of elaborate psychological torture with no physical reality behind it. Then, perhaps 500 feet ahead, something appeared in his lane. It looked like a large section of truck tire, the kind of blowout debris that commercial vehicles occasionally shed and that poses a serious hazard to other motorists. It was positioned almost perfectly center in his lane, impossible to safely pass over without risking damage to his own vehicle or loss of control. Every instinct Eldridge possessed screamed at him to swerve left, to move into the passing lane and avoid the obstacle entirely. His hands began to turn the wheel automatically, muscle memory and training taking over before conscious thought could intervene. But Luther Cade's voice cut through his panic, urgent and commanding. "Don't swerve, Eldridge. The debris isn't real. Maintain course. Close your eyes now." The words hit Eldridge like an electric shock, jolting him back to awareness of what he was supposed to do versus what his body wanted to do. He forced his hands to stillness on the wheel, fighting against every trained response, and as the debris rushed toward him, filling his windshield, he squeezed his eyes shut. The darkness behind his eyelids was absolute and terrifying. He was traveling at 70 miles per hour with his eyes closed, deliberately driving blind toward an obstacle that might or might not be physically real, trusting the word of a radio voice over the evidence of his own senses. Time seemed to slow, each heartbeat distinct and loud, his breathing harsh in the enclosed space of his cab. He counted seconds in his head, estimated that it should take approximately 3 seconds to cover the distance to where the debris had been, to pass through the zone of danger and emerge on the other side. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, and he felt nothing. No impact, no sudden jolt, no sound of debris striking his truck or being crushed beneath his wheels. Eldridge opened his eyes, and the highway was clear. No debris visible ahead or behind, just empty asphalt stretching into the darkness. His truck was maintaining its lane perfectly, speed constant. No indication that anything unusual had occurred. He'd done it, followed Luther Cade's impossible instructions and survived the moment that was supposed to have killed him. But instead of relief, he felt a strange emptiness, as if something fundamental had shifted in his relationship with reality. He'd crossed a threshold, accepted that his perceptions couldn't be trusted, that the world operated according to rules more complex and strange than he'd previously believed. "Well done, Eldridge," Luther Cade said, genuine warmth in his voice. "You trusted the process, overrode your instincts, and changed your fate. You've avoided the accident that claimed you in other iterations of this night. But I need you to understand something important. You're not out of the overlap zone yet. What you just experienced was the most dramatic moment, the point where temporal frames most strongly diverged. But there are still several miles where past and present and potential futures are bleeding into each other. You need to keep driving, keep maintaining your focus until you pass mile marker 85. That's the boundary, the point where the highway returns to normal causality." Eldridge nodded, though no one could see the gesture, and focused on keeping his truck moving forward. Mile marker 97 passed, the number that had taken on such ominous significance now just another marker, identical to all the others. He should have felt triumph, or at least relief, but instead he felt drained, exhausted in ways that went beyond simple physical fatigue. The psychological strain of the past hours had extracted a toll that he was only beginning to recognize. His hands trembled slightly on the wheel, fine motor control degraded by stress hormones as flooding his system. He forced himself to take deep, deliberate breaths, using a technique he'd learned years ago for managing anxiety during difficult driving conditions. "I want to tell you what you prevented," Luther Cade said, his voice taking on a reflective quality. "In the original timeline, the one where you swerved to avoid the phantom debris, your truck crossed the median at approximately 2:47 a.m. There was another vehicle in the westbound lanes at that moment, a sedan carrying a family returning from a wedding in Flagstaff. The father was driving, his wife asleep in the passenger seat, their 2 teenage daughters in the back, also asleep. When your truck crossed into their path, the father had approximately 1.2 seconds to react, not nearly enough time to avoid a collision with a vehicle weighing 40 times more than his own. The description made Eldridge's stomach clench. He was hearing about people who had died in a timeline that no longer existed, or perhaps existed somewhere in the quantum foam of unrealized possibilities. Luther Cade continued, each word carefully chosen, painting a picture that was both specific and devastating. The impact killed all 4 occupants of the sedan instantly. Your injuries were severe but not immediately fatal. You survived for approximately 6 hours, conscious for much of that time, aware of what had happened, aware that your actions had ended 4 lives. The guilt and horror you experienced in those final hours were, according to the emergency responders who tried to comfort you, some of the most intense suffering they'd ever witnessed. Eldridge felt tears streaming down his face, though he couldn't remember when he'd started crying. He was mourning people who hadn't died, grieving for a version of himself that had experienced that unbearable guilt before succumbing to his injuries. The multiplicity of timelines, The awareness that choices could branch into radically different outcomes made him feel unmoored from any stable sense of identity. Which version was the real Eldridge Poe? The one who had died in guilt and agony. The one driving through this surreal night. Some other iteration in a probability space too complex to fully comprehend. But that timeline no longer exists as your reality, Luther Cade said gently. You made a different choice, took a different path, and those people, that family, they're sleeping safely in their beds right now, completely unaware of how close they came to death. You saved them, Eldridge, by doing the hardest thing a human being can do, trusting that your perceptions were wrong when every sense insisted they were right. That took courage of a kind most people never have to demonstrate. You should be proud of that, even as you process the horror of what you prevented. Mile marker 95 passed, then 94, 93. The numbers counting down toward the boundary Luther Cade had mentioned. Eldridge drove in a kind of daze, going through the motions of operating his vehicle, while his mind struggled to integrate the experience he'd just survived. The highway looked normal again, or as normal as anything could look after the past hours of wrongness and impossibility. He thought he saw stars beginning to brighten overhead, the dimming effect that had troubled him earlier starting to reverse. Perhaps that was a sign he was approaching the edge of the overlap zone, returning to normal reality where celestial objects maintained consistent luminosity and time flowed in a single direction. At mile marker 90, Luther Cade spoke again, but his voice had changed, become more distant, as if the signal was weakening or he was pulling away from some metaphorical microphone. Eldridge, I'm going to leave you soon. The overlap zone ends at mile marker 85, as I mentioned, and beyond that point you won't be able to hear my broadcast anymore. Before I go, I want to give you one final piece of information, something you can use to verify that what happened tonight was real and not some kind of stress-induced hallucination or breakdown. When you reach Kingman, go to the truck stop off exit 53, the big one with the chrome shop and the 24-hour diner. In the diner, there's a waitress named Marlene, works the overnight shift, has been there for over 15 years. Ask her about Luther Cade and the Desert Frequency broadcast. She'll understand what you've experienced, because she's one of the few people who knows the truth about this section of highway and what happens here on certain nights. The instruction was concrete and specific, offering a way to ground the night's events in verifiable reality. Eldridge committed it to memory, repeating it silently to himself. Exit 53, truck stop, diner, waitress named Marlene, ask about Luther Cade. It would either confirm his sanity or reveal the depths of his delusion, but either way, it would provide closure to an experience that currently existed in a state of terrifying ambiguity. Mile marker 87 appeared, then 86, and Eldridge could feel something changing in the quality of the air, the texture of reality itself. It was like passing through an invisible membrane, emerging from water into air, a transition that was more felt than seen. Drive safely, Eldridge Poe, Luther Cade said, his voice now barely audible through increasing static. Remember what you learned tonight, about the nature of time and choice and the courage it takes to see past illusion. You're one of the lucky ones, someone who was given a chance to change their fate and had the strength to take it. Not everyone gets that opportunity, and not everyone who gets it succeeds. You did. Be proud of that, even when the memory troubles your dreams. And know that somewhere, in ways you can't perceive, a family sleeps safely because you found the courage to drive blind toward danger. The radio signal dissolved into static, and no amount of adjusting the tuning brought Luther Cade's voice back. Eldridge cycled through other frequencies searching for any trace of the Desert Frequency broadcast, but found only conventional programming, late-night talk shows and music, and paid religious broadcasting. At mile marker 85, he felt something release inside him, a tension he'd been carrying finally letting go. The stars overhead were bright again, brilliant points of light in the clear desert sky. His CB radio crackled with sudden activity, truckers chatting on Channel 19, normal conversations about traffic conditions and where to find cheap fuel. Eldridge grabbed his CB and transmitted, his voice hoarse but functional. "This is Eldridge Poe, westbound on I-40 approaching Kingman. Anyone out there, please respond. Let me know you can hear me." Immediately, responses came back, multiple truckers acknowledging his transmission, asking if he needed assistance, commenting on road conditions ahead. The simple normalcy of these exchanges was almost overwhelming, evidence that he'd returned to a reality where communication worked as expected, where other human beings existed and could be reached. He was no longer alone in the Arizona darkness, but as relief washed over him, bringing with it the trembling aftermath of extreme stress, Eldridge knew that something had changed fundamentally in how he understood the world. He'd experienced something that defied rational explanation, been given knowledge about the nature of reality that most people never received. The highway ahead looked identical to the highway behind. Same asphalt, same markings, same desert landscape. But he now knew that surfaces could deceive, that what appeared solid and singular might actually be layered and multiple. The time itself was more fluid and negotiable than common experience suggested. He drove toward Kingman with new eyes, watching for the exit that would take him to the truck stop where he could begin seeking answers, or at least confirmation that he hadn't simply lost his mind somewhere between Flagstaff and the western Arizona border. The lights of Kingman appeared on the horizon like a constellation fallen to earth, a cluster of civilization in the vast darkness of the Arizona desert. Eldridge felt an almost physical relief at the sight, evidence that he was approaching normalcy, places where people lived and worked according to predictable schedules and comprehensible rules. His GPS showed exit 53 approaching in approximately 8 miles, the location Luther Cade had specified, where supposedly a waitress named Marlene could provide answers or at least validation of his experience. The final miles passed in a kind of suspended state, Eldridge simultaneously eager to reach his destination and dreading what he might learn there. His hands had stopped shaking, but a deep exhaustion had settled into his bones, the kind that comes from prolonged stress rather than simple physical exertion. He took the exit at exactly 4:17 a.m., according to his dashboard clock, the time feeling significant somehow, as if he'd lost or gained hours during his passage through the overlap zone, though his GPS tracking showed normal elapsed time for the distance covered. The truck stop was exactly as Luther Cade had described it, a large facility with multiple fuel islands, a chrome shop that advertised custom work, and a 24-hour diner whose neon sign cast pink and blue light across the parking lot. Eldridge maneuvered his rig into a space designated for overnight parking, engaged his air brakes, and sat for a long moment in the sudden silence after shutting down his engine. The absence of road noise and diesel rumble was disorienting after hours of continuous motion and sound. He climbed down from his cab, his legs unsteady after the prolonged drive, and made his way across the parking lot toward the diner. The early morning air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of creosote and dust that characterized the desert Southwest. Other trucks sat in silent rows, their drivers presumably sleeping in their cabs or inside the facility's shower rooms, unaware of the strange journey that had brought Eldridge to this place. The diner's interior was bright and aggressively normal, all chrome and red vinyl booths, walls decorated with vintage highway memorabilia and photographs of classic trucks. Perhaps a dozen people occupied various booths and counter seats, mostly truckers nursing coffee and working through plates of eggs and hash browns, the standard fuel of the overnight road warrior. A waitress emerged from the kitchen area, carrying a pot of coffee and wearing the kind of professionally pleasant expression that service workers develop after years of dealing with the public at all hours. She was perhaps 60 years old, with iron gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the efficient movements of someone who'd been doing this job for decades. Eldridge's heart rate increased as he realized this must be Marlene, the person Luther Cade had directed him to find. She gestured toward an empty booth near the window, and Eldridge slid into it, accepting the menu she offered with hands that he noticed were still trembling slightly. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice carrying the slight rasp of someone who'd spent too many years in smoke-filled spaces before such environments were banned. Eldridge nodded, and she filled the heavy ceramic mug in front of him with practiced precision, not spilling a drop despite the fact that she was simultaneously pulling an order pad from her apron pocket. Kitchens got everything on the menu available, though if you want pancakes, I'd recommend the blueberry. Cook just made a fresh batch of compote. She delivered this information with the easy authority of someone who knew her workplace intimately, who could guide customers toward good choices without being pushy about it. Eldridge ordered without really thinking about it, his mind focused on how to broach the subject Luther Cade had instructed him to discuss. He waited until Marlene had taken his order to the kitchen and returned to refill his coffee, and then, keeping his voice low enough that other diners wouldn't overhear, he said the words that felt simultaneously absurd and necessary. "I need to ask you about Luther Cade and the Desert Frequency broadcast." Marlene's hand froze mid-pour, just for a fraction of a second, before she completed the motion and set the coffee pot down on the table. Her expression didn't change dramatically, but something shifted behind her eyes, a recognition that went beyond simple name identification. "You drove through it tonight," she said, and it wasn't a question. She slid into the booth across from him, abandoning the professional distance that service workers typically maintain with customers. "The overlap zone between Seligman and here. You heard Luther Cade's broadcast, got the warnings, made it through." Her voice was matter-of-fact, discussing the impossible with the same tone she might use to comment on weather conditions or traffic patterns. Eldridge felt something unclench in his chest, a validation that what he'd experienced had external reality, that he wasn't suffering from some elaborate delusion or breakdown. Marlene continued, her eyes searching his face with an intensity that suggested she was evaluating something specific, looking for signs or symptoms he couldn't identify. "How much did he tell you?" she asked. "About what that section of highway is, why it behaves the way it does on certain nights?" Eldridge found himself recounting the entire experience, the words spilling out in a rush that surprised him with its intensity. He described the impossible conversation with Vernal Pike, the wrecked flatbed that shouldn't have been there, the historical stories about Harold Weems and the 1967 accident, the phantom debris he'd had to drive through blind. Marlene listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as if confirming details she already knew, her expression grave but unsurprised. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, seeming to consider how much to tell him in return. "Luther Cade was a real person," she finally said, her voice dropping even lower, forcing Eldridge to lean forward to hear her clearly. "He was a radio personality back in the 1970s, did an overnight program out of a small station in Flagstaff. He specialized in what they used to call highway hypnosis broadcasts, programs designed specifically for long-distance drivers, using certain rhythms and tones to keep people alert without being jarring. He was good at it, really good. Truckers used to request his frequency, would plan their routes to stay in range of his signal as long as possible." She paused to sip from a coffee mug she'd brought with her, her eyes distant as if seeing into the past. In 1977, Luther was driving back from the station one night, using that same stretch of I-40 you just came through. He was in his personal vehicle, a sedan, nothing like the trucks he usually talked about on his show. According to the investigation, he swerved to avoid something in the road, lost control, and went off the highway. They found his car 3 days later, down in a ravine about half a mile from the road. Luther was still in the driver's seat, dead from injuries sustained in the crash. Marlene's expression had become haunted, suggesting a personal connection to the story beyond mere historical knowledge. They never determined what he swerved to avoid. The road was clear, no debris, no evidence of any obstacle. Some people thought he fell asleep. Others suggested medical emergency, maybe a stroke or heart attack. But the truckers who'd been listening to his broadcasts over the years, they had different theories. Eldridge felt his skin prickling with the implications of what Marlene was describing. Luther Cade, the voice that had guided him through the overlap zone, had died decades ago in circumstances eerily similar to the accident Eldridge himself had narrowly avoided. The temporal impossibilities were multiplying, creating a web of causality that defied linear understanding. Marlene continued her narrative, clearly accustomed to telling this story, perhaps having shared it with other drivers who'd experienced similar nights. About 6 months after Luther's death, truckers started reporting strange experiences on that section of highway. They'd hear broadcasts that sounded like Luther's old program, using his voice, his style, but discussing current events, giving advice about road conditions that the original Luther couldn't have known about. At first, people dismissed it as copycats, maybe someone doing a tribute show, but the details were too specific, too accurate. The broadcasts knew things about individual drivers, about accidents that were about to happen, about temporal anomalies that shouldn't exist. The diner felt simultaneously too bright and somehow unreal, as if Eldridge was still caught in some version of the overlap zone where normal rules applied inconsistently. Other customers continued their meals and conversations, completely unaware of the impossible discussion happening in the corner booth. Marlene reached across the table and placed her hand over Eldridge's, a gesture that was both comforting and unsettling in its intimacy. Whatever Luther Cade is now, whatever form his consciousness took after his death, he's still trying to do what he did in life: keep drivers safe, help them navigate dangerous conditions, warn them about hazards they can't see coming. But he's operating from outside normal time, able to perceive multiple timelines simultaneously, to see accidents before they happen and intervene to prevent them. You're not the first person he's guided through that zone, and you won't be the last. Eldridge pulled his hand back, needing physical distance to process what he was hearing. So I was saved by a ghost, by some kind of temporal echo of a dead radio host? The words sounded absurd even as he spoke them, but Marlene didn't flinch from the characterization. "Call it what you want," she said with a slight shrug. "Ghost, echo, consciousness, operating in higher dimensions, whatever framework helps you make sense of it. The practical reality is that certain sections of highway, particularly that stretch between Seligman and Kingman, exist in a state of temporal instability. On certain nights, under conditions that nobody fully understands, the boundaries between past and present and future become permeable. People experience overlap, see things from other time frames, encounter possibilities that haven't manifested yet, or events that already occurred decades ago." The food arrived then, delivered by a younger waitress who seemed completely oblivious to the tension at the table, and Marlene excused herself to attend to other customers. Eldridge stared at the plate in front of him, eggs and bacon and toast that represented normalcy and sustenance, but found he had no appetite. The exhaustion he'd felt earlier had transformed into a kind of hyper-alertness, his mind racing through implications and questions faster than he could organize them into coherent thoughts. He forced himself to eat mechanically, recognizing that his body needed fuel even if his mind was too preoccupied to generate hunger signals. The coffee helped, its bitter heat grounding him in physical sensation, providing an anchor to the present moment. Marlene returned after perhaps 20 minutes, sliding back into the booth and studying him with an expression that mixed concern and evaluation. "You're handling this better than some people do," she observed. "I've seen drivers come in here so shaken they can barely speak, some so convinced they've lost their minds that they quit trucking altogether. The fact that you're sitting here eating breakfast, asking coherent questions, that's a good sign. It means you've got the psychological flexibility to integrate strange experiences without breaking." The compliment, if that's what it was, felt oddly clinical, as if Marlene was assessing him against some established criteria for measuring post-traumatic resilience. "What happens now?" Eldridge asked, surprising himself with the question. He'd expected to ask for more information, for explanations about the physics or metaphysics of temporal overlap zones, for details about other drivers' experiences. But what emerged was something more fundamental, a question about how to proceed with his life given what he now knew about the nature of reality. Marlene smiled, a sad expression that suggested she understood the deeper implications of his question. "Now you make a choice," she said simply. "You can try to forget tonight, treat it as an anomalous experience that doesn't need to be integrated into your worldview. Drive different routes, avoid that section of highway. Tell yourself it was stress or lack of sleep or some kind of hallucination. A lot of people choose that path, and I don't judge them for it. Easier to maintain the comfortable illusion that the world operates according to simple rules." She paused, taking another sip of her coffee, and Eldridge found himself waiting for the alternative, the other path she was about to describe. "Or you can accept what you experienced as genuine, as revealing something true about the nature of reality that most people never encounter. You can recognize that the world is stranger and more complex than conventional wisdom suggests, that time isn't as linear as we pretend, that consciousness can persist in forms we don't understand. If you choose that path, if you accept the truth of tonight, then you become part of a very small community of people who know what's really happening on certain American highways, who understand that the infrastructure we've built isn't just physical but somehow metaphysical as well." The choice she was describing felt enormous, life-altering in ways that went beyond simple belief or disbelief. Eldridge realized he was being offered membership in something, a group of people who'd crossed a threshold and could never fully return to naive understanding. He thought about the family in the sedan, the people he'd saved by trusting Luther Cade and driving blind toward phantom debris. That fact alone, regardless of how inexplicable the mechanism, seemed to argue for accepting the reality of his experience. He'd made a choice in that crucial moment that had prevented deaths, and didn't that validate everything else, make it impossible to dismiss as delusion? "I need to know something," Eldridge said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite identify. "Luther Cade, or whatever he is now, he said I'd changed my fate, that in other timelines I died in that accident. But if he's already seen multiple versions of this night, if he knows how it all plays out, then was my choice ever really free? Or was I just following a script he'd already written, playing out a version he'd already observed?" The question touched on free will and determinism, on whether consciousness could genuinely choose if choices were already observed from outside time. Marlene's expression suggested she'd heard this question before, probably from many other drivers who'd experienced similar interventions. "I don't pretend to understand the metaphysics," she said carefully, "but here's what I believe, based on conversations I've had with Luther on those rare occasions when I can reach him. Every moment contains multiple possibilities, and consciousness collapses those possibilities into singular actualities through the act of choosing. From outside time, from whatever vantage point Luther now occupies, he can see the full range of possibilities, all the different versions of tonight that might manifest. But which one becomes your reality, the timeline you actually inhabit? That's determined by your choices in the moment. You chose to trust his warnings, to drive through that phantom debris, and that choice created the timeline where you survived and that family lived. Other versions of you made different choices and ended up in different timelines. Free will and determinism aren't contradictory. They're just different perspectives on the same process. The philosophical explanation was simultaneously comforting and deeply unsettling. Eldridge finished his coffee and gestured for a refill, using the mundane action to buy time for processing. Outside the diner windows, the sky was beginning to lighten, the absolute darkness of the desert night giving way to the deep blue that precedes dawn. Other truckers were stirring, heading back to their vehicles to continue journeys interrupted by mandatory rest periods or the need for food and fuel. Normal life continuing according to normal patterns, while Eldridge sat in a booth discussing impossible radio broadcasts and temporal anomalies with a waitress who spoke about such things as casually as if describing menu items. "One more thing you should know," Marlene said, and her tone suggested this was important, something she'd been building toward throughout the conversation. Luther doesn't just guide people through the overlap zone. He also recruits, in a sense. He's looking for people who can handle the truth, who have the psychological strength and flexibility to accept that reality is stranger than they were taught. People who might be willing to help others who encounter similar situations, to provide support and validation and practical information. I'm one of those people stationed here specifically because this truck stop is where a lot of drivers end up after experiencing the zone. There are others at different locations, creating a loose network of informed individuals who can help process and integrate these experiences. The implication was clear, and Eldridge felt something shift inside him, a recognition that he was being offered a role, a purpose that extended beyond simply surviving an anomalous night. He could become part of the support system, someone who helped other confused and frightened drivers make sense of the impossible. The idea was both attractive and daunting, suggesting a commitment to a reality that most people would consider insane. But he thought again about the family he'd saved, about the lives preserved because Luther Cade had warned him, and he'd had the courage to trust that warning. If he could play even a small role in helping others navigate similar experiences, didn't he have an obligation to do so? "I need time," Eldridge said finally, recognizing that any decision made in his current state of exhaustion and emotional turbulence would be suspect. "I need to finish this delivery, get some real sleep, let my mind settle before I commit to anything, but I'm not dismissing what you're telling me. I can't, not after what I experienced tonight. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm open to learning more, to staying in contact with this network you're describing. Just not right now. Not when I'm barely holding myself together." Marlene nodded, seeming to accept his position without judgment. She pulled a small card from her apron pocket and slid it across the table, a plain, white card with nothing but a phone number printed on it. "When you're ready to talk more, call that number," she said. "Day or night, someone will answer. We'll put you in touch with people who can help you process what happened, who can provide context and information about the broader patterns at work. And if you decide you want to be part of the network, we'll figure out what role makes sense for you, how you can contribute based on your particular routes and schedule." She stood then, returning to her role as waitress, the strange intimacy of their conversation dissolving back into professional distance. Eldridge paid his bill, left a substantial tip that Marlene accepted with a knowing smile, and walked back out into the parking lot as dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. His truck sat where he'd left it, solid and familiar, a piece of his normal life waiting to resume its function. Eldridge climbed back into the cab, started the engine, and pulled out of the parking lot toward the highway that would take him to his delivery point in California. The road looked ordinary, just asphalt and lane markings and traffic that was beginning to increase as the desert awakened to a new day. But Eldridge knew now that surfaces deceived, that the highways he'd driven for 18 years carried layers of history and possibility that he'd never suspected. He merged onto the westbound interstate, joining the flow of morning traffic, just another trucker moving goods across America's transportation network. But as he drove, he found his hand drifting toward the radio, his fingers hovering over the tuning dial. Part of him wanted to search for the desert frequency, to see if Luther Cade's voice was still broadcasting somewhere on the electromagnetic spectrum. Another part recognized that such searching was pointless, that whatever connection he'd made with that impossible broadcast had been specific to the overlap zone, to that particular section of highway under those particular conditions. He'd emerged from that experience changed, carrying knowledge that most people never acquired, burdened and privileged in equal measure. The card Marlene had given him sat in his shirt pocket, a physical reminder that what he'd experienced was real, that there were others who knew the truth about America's haunted highways. Eldridge didn't know yet whether he'd call that number, whether he'd accept the invitation to become part of Luther Cade's network of informed witnesses. But the card's presence was oddly comforting, evidence that he wasn't alone in his knowledge, that the impossible thing he'd survived was part of a larger pattern that others had encountered and navigated. As Kingman disappeared in his mirrors and the highway stretched endlessly ahead, Eldridge found himself wondering about other roads, other routes he'd driven hundreds of times over his career. Were there other overlap zones out there? Other sections where temporal boundaries grew thin and past and present and future bled together? Were there other Luther Cades, other consciousness operating outside normal time, guiding and protecting drivers through invisible dangers? The questions multiplied, creating a new framework for understanding the world, one that accommodated impossibility alongside mundane reality. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last remnants of night, and Eldridge drove on, carrying his cargo and his secrets west toward California and whatever future waited there. Behind him, the Arizona desert held its mysteries, ancient and modern intertwined, highways built on top of trails, built on top of paths that stretched back to the beginning of human presence in this landscape. And somewhere in that layered geography, Luther Cade's voice continued broadcasting, reaching through time to warn and guide and save those who had the courage to listen and trust, keeping his eternal watch over the lonely roads where reality grew thin and possibilities multiplied in the darkness. The New Mexico night was different from other southwestern darkness, possessing a quality that veteran truckers recognized immediately but struggled to articulate. Perhaps it was the way sound carried across the high desert plains, traveling impossible distances without degradation, or the manner in which the sparse vegetation created pockets of absolute shadow between pools of starlight. Dalton Rigsby had been hauling freight through this landscape for 12 years, long enough to develop an intimate familiarity with its moods and peculiarities, yet still finding himself occasionally unsettled by the profound isolation that characterized Highway 285 between Roswell and Carlsbad. At 46 years old, he'd accumulated enough experience to trust his instincts about when something felt wrong. And tonight, despite perfectly clear weather and optimal driving conditions, something felt decidedly off. His Freightliner Cascadia maintained steady progress southbound, its headlights carving a tunnel of illumination through darkness that seemed to press in from all sides with almost physical weight. The load he carried, manufacturing components destined for a facility outside of Carlsbad, rode securely in his trailer, properly balanced and generating none of the concerning sounds that might indicate shifting cargo or mechanical issues. Everything about the truck's performance suggested a routine night haul, the kind of drive Dalton had completed hundreds of times before without incident or concern. Yet he found himself checking his mirrors more frequently than necessary, scanning the empty highway behind him for vehicles that weren't there, experiencing a low-grade anxiety that had no obvious source or justification. The CB radio mounted on his dashboard had been unusually quiet for the past hour, carrying only occasional bursts of static and the rare transmission from truckers too distant to communicate clearly. Channel 19, the standard frequency that commercial drivers monitored for traffic updates and casual conversation, typically maintained at least sporadic activity even during the loneliest overnight hours. But tonight the channel sat silent except for that persistent static, a white noise backdrop that somehow emphasized rather than alleviated the sense of isolation. Dalton had considered switching to one of the alternative channels, maybe finding a late-night group of drivers maintaining conversation to pass the miles, but something kept him locked on 19, waiting for transmissions that refused to come. His GPS showed him approximately 35 miles north of Carlsbad, traveling through a section of highway that offered nothing in terms of services or points of interest. No towns, no rest areas, no businesses of any kind existed along this stretch, just empty desert punctuated by the occasional ranch access road leading off into darkness. The nearest significant human presence was the small community of Loving, still about 20 miles ahead, barely more than a cluster of buildings serving the needs of local oil field workers and passing motorists. Dalton had driven through Loving countless times, never stopping unless fuel or food was urgently needed, treating it as just another waypoint on routes that measured success in miles covered rather than places experienced. The digital clock on his dashboard read 2:34 a.m., when the CB radio crackled to life with something more substantial than background static. The transmission was weak initially, breaking up into fragments of words that suggested someone broadcasting from significant distance or with inadequate equipment. Dalton instinctively reached for his radio's squelch control, adjusting it to clarify the incoming signal, and gradually a voice emerged from the interference. Female, young-sounding, carrying unmistakable notes of distress and confusion. "Anyone out there? Can anyone hear me? I'm stuck and I don't know. Please, if someone can hear this, I need help." Dalton grabbed his CB microphone immediately, the automatic response of someone who'd spent enough years on the road to take calls for assistance seriously. "This is southbound on 285. I'm reading you, but your signal's weak. What's your location and what kind of trouble are you having? Over." He released the transmit button and waited, watching the radio's display for indication of response, but several seconds passed with only static. He was about to transmit again when the voice returned, clearer this time, though still overlaid with interference that made certain words difficult to parse. "Thank God," someone answered. I think I'm somewhere on 285, north of Carlsbad, maybe? My truck broke down, just died on me, and I can't get it started again. I don't know what happened. Everything was fine, and then suddenly nothing worked." The explanation triggered Dalton's professional instincts, running through mental checklists of common mechanical failures that might cause a commercial vehicle to lose all power simultaneously. Complete electrical system failure was rare but possible, potentially caused by alternator breakdown or catastrophic battery failure. Fuel system issues could create similar symptoms if a truck exhausted its supply or experienced pump malfunction. He keyed his microphone again, keeping his voice calm and measured, the tone of someone who'd talked other drivers through stressful situations before. "Okay, first thing is don't panic. Mechanical problems happen, and most of them are fixable, or at least manageable. Can you tell me more specifically where you are? Any mile markers visible, landmarks, anything that might help me locate you? I'm southbound right now, so if you're north of Carlsbad on 285, there's a good chance I'll be passing your position soon." The response came faster this time, the caller's voice carrying increased urgency. "I can't see mile markers from where I stopped. It's too dark, and my lights aren't working anymore. Everything electrical is dead, including my flashlight. I'm just sitting here in complete darkness, and I can hear. There are sounds outside the truck, like something moving around out in the desert. I know that sounds crazy, probably just coyotes or wind, but I'm really scared. How long until you think you might reach me?" Dalton felt a twinge of concern at the description of total electrical failure. For a modern semi-truck to lose all power, including battery-operated devices, suggested either catastrophic system damage or something more unusual, though he couldn't immediately identify what that something might be. "Let's figure out your location first," Dalton said, trying to maintain his reassuring tone despite growing unease about the situation. "When did you last see a mile marker or pass through a town? How long have you been stopped?" The questions were practical, designed to establish a timeline and narrow down the probable search area. But as he waited for response, Dalton found himself scanning the highway ahead more intently, looking for any sign of a stopped vehicle or emergency lights. The road remained empty as far as his headlights could reach, just unbroken pavement disappearing into the darkness, bordered by desert scrub that looked uniformly gray and lifeless in the monochromatic illumination. "I passed through a small place maybe 20 minutes before the truck died," the voice said, audibly struggling to remain calm. "It was tiny, just a few buildings. I don't remember the name. There was a gas station that looked closed, maybe a church or something. After that, nothing but empty highway, until everything stopped working." The description matched several communities along this route, none of them large enough or distinctive enough to provide definitive identification without additional information. Dalton did quick mental calculations, estimating distances based on the caller's timeline and average highway speeds. If she'd driven 20 minutes beyond a small settlement before experiencing mechanical failure, she could be anywhere in a 40-mile stretch of highway depending on which town she'd passed and how fast she'd been traveling. "Okay, here's what I need you to do," Dalton instructed, shifting into problem-solving mode. "Tell me about your cargo. What are you hauling and how heavy is your load? Sometimes weight distribution issues can cause problems that look like electrical failures. Also, what's your name?" "I'm Dalton Rigsby out of Albuquerque. Been running these routes for over a decade. Always easier to coordinate when we're not just anonymous voices on the radio." He kept his tone conversational, trying to establish rapport that might help calm the distressed caller while gathering information that could assist in locating and diagnosing her problem. The response, when it came, carried a quality that made the hair on Dalton's neck stand up in a primal response he couldn't immediately explain. "My name is Marla Dean," the voice said, and there was something in the way she pronounced her name, a slight hesitation or emphasis that felt significant without being obviously wrong. "I'm hauling drilling equipment for the oil fields, heavy load, properly secured and balanced according to regulations. I've been driving professionally for 6 years, never had any serious mechanical problems before tonight. This just doesn't make sense, the way everything failed at once. It's like the truck just stopped being a truck, if that makes any sense at all." The description was simultaneously too specific and too vague, providing technical details while also veering into metaphorical territory that suggested confusion or possibly the early stages of a panic. Dalton checked his GPS, noting that he was now approximately 25 miles north of Carlsbad, which meant if Marla Dean's truck was anywhere in the probable search area, he should be approaching it within the next 15 to 20 minutes. He scanned both shoulders of the highway more carefully, looking for any shape that might be a stopped vehicle, though the darkness and distance made identification difficult until he was almost on top of any given object. The landscape offered few reference points, just the hypnotic repetition of highway infrastructure and desert vegetation that could make distances and times blur together during long overnight drives. He keyed his microphone again, maintaining the conversation both to keep Marla calm and to ensure they stayed connected until he could reach her position. "Marla, I'm going to keep talking to you while I drive. Make sure we don't lose contact. Can you tell me what company you're driving for? Might help me identify your truck when I get close." The question was practical, but also served as a subtle test, providing information that could be verified and that might offer additional context about the situation. Professional drivers typically identified strongly with their employer or owner-operator status, and the answer would tell Dalton something about who he was dealing with and what resources might be available to assist with the breakdown. The silence that followed his question stretched longer than previous gaps in communication, long enough that Dalton wondered if the signal had been lost entirely. When Marla's voice returned, it carried a strange quality, slightly hollow or distant, as if she was speaking from inside a confined space or through some kind of interference that affected tone more than volume. "I'm driving for Permian Transport out of Hobbs, a small company, mostly regional work in the oil patch. You probably haven't heard of them unless you work this area regularly." The response was reasonable, matching what Dalton knew about the dozens of small carriers that served southeastern New Mexico's energy industry. Yet something about it troubled him in ways he couldn't articulate. The unease was growing stronger now, moving from background anxiety to something more immediate and urgent, though he still couldn't identify any concrete reason for the feeling. "I know some of the Permian Transport trucks," Dalton said, which was partially true, though he couldn't recall any specific details about the company's fleet or identifying characteristics. "Listen, Marla, I need you to try something for me. I know you said all your electrical is dead, but modern trucks have multiple redundant systems. Try the emergency flashers, the ones that work off a separate circuit. If you can get those working, it'll make it a lot easier for me to spot you when I get close." The instruction was sound from a practical standpoint, though Dalton was also curious whether the caller would be able to follow through, whether this was genuinely just a mechanical failure or something more complex. "I'll try," Marla responded, and Dalton could hear rustling sounds through the CB speaker, presumably her moving around in her cab attempting to access controls. "Nothing's happening. I'm pushing the button, but no lights are coming on. God, it's so dark out here, I can't see anything. And those sounds are getting closer, whatever's moving around outside my truck. I know I should probably just be worried about the mechanical problem, but I keep thinking about all the stories truckers tell about weird things happening on empty highways at night. You know the kind of stories I mean, right? The ones that are always about someone else, someone's friend or a driver they met at a truck stop, but never anyone who'll admit it happened to them directly." The reference to trucker folklore made Dalton's unease spike sharply. Every professional driver knew those stories, the modern legends that circulated through the community like a oral tradition passed between generations. Tales of ghost hitchhikers and phantom trucks, of radio broadcasts that knew things they shouldn't know, of stretches of highway where time behaved strangely, and people encountered impossibilities that they could never quite explain afterward. Most drivers treated these stories as entertainment, campfire tales adapted for the diesel age. But there was always an undercurrent of genuine belief, a recognition that the profession's isolation and odd hours created conditions where strange things could happen without witnesses or verification. "I know the stories," Dalton admitted, keeping his voice carefully neutral. "Been hearing variations of them since I started driving. Never experienced anything I couldn't explain rationally, but I've learned to keep an open mind about what's possible on these roads." He paused, checking his GPS again and noting that his position should be bringing him close to the probable area where a stopped truck might be visible. The highway ahead remained obstinately empty, no shapes or lights breaking the monotonous darkness. "Marla, I should be getting close to your position based on the timeline you gave me. Can you try using your air horn? Even if your electrical is dead, the pneumatic system should still be functional as long as you've got air pressure in your tanks. A couple of blasts on the horn might help me pinpoint your exact location." The response came after another extended pause, and when Marla spoke, her voice had changed somehow, become flatter, less emotional, as if she was reading from a script or describing events happening to someone else. "I don't think I can do that, Dalton. I don't think my truck works that way anymore. Actually, I'm starting to realize that a lot of things don't work the way I thought they did." Have you ever had the experience of suddenly understanding that something you believed to be true was actually wrong? That your entire framework for understanding reality needed to be revised? That's what's happening to me right now, sitting here in the darkness, listening to sounds that shouldn't be there, trying to remember details that keep slipping away when I focus on them directly. Dalton felt cold despite the warmth of his truck's cabin, a visceral response to words that suggested psychological distress beyond simple mechanical trouble. Marla Dean was describing symptoms that could indicate several concerning possibilities: panic attack, dissociative episode, possibly even medical emergency like stroke or severe hypoglycemia affecting cognitive function. He needed to reach her quickly, assess the situation directly, and potentially call for emergency medical services if her condition was as serious as her words suggested. But first, he needed to actually find her, and despite now being well into the search area, he still saw no sign of a stopped vehicle. "Marla, listen to me carefully," Dalton said, using the firm but gentle tone he'd learned when talking to his daughter during her childhood nightmares. "You might be experiencing some kind of medical issue, something affecting your thinking and perception. That's okay, it happens, and help is coming. But I need you to stay with me, keep talking, help me find you. Can you describe what's immediately around your truck? Not what you're hearing or feeling, just concrete physical details. What's on your left side, your right? What can you see out your windshield, even if it's just vague shapes in darkness?" The silence that followed stretched so long that Dalton began to wonder if contact had been lost entirely, if Marla Dean had collapsed, or if her radio had finally died along with her truck's other systems. He was about to transmit again, to call out and try to re-establish connection, when her voice emerged from the CB speaker but changed now in fundamental ways. The distress and fear were gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like curiosity or wonder, as if she was discovering something fascinating rather than terrifying. "I can see my truck now, Dalton. I'm outside it, looking at it from a distance, and I can see that it's been here much longer than I thought. The tires are flat, the paint is sun-faded and peeling. There are weeds growing up around the wheels. How long have I been sitting here? How long has this truck been stopped on this highway?" Dalton's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his breath coming faster as the wrongness of the situation crystallized into something specific and dreadful. He'd been monitoring Channel 19 for years, had heard thousands of conversations and transmissions, had developed an instinct for distinguishing genuine communication from interference or equipment malfunction. What he was hearing now didn't fit any normal category, didn't match the pattern of a driver experiencing mechanical trouble or even medical emergency. The voice coming through his CB speaker was describing an impossible situation, or possibly revealing something that had been true all along, but hidden beneath surface assumptions about causality and time. "Marla, where exactly are you right now?" Dalton asked, his voice tight with tension he could no longer fully suppress. "Are you inside your truck or outside it? What do you mean you can see it from a distance?" The questions felt inadequate even as he spoke them, attempting to impose rational framework on something that was actively resisting rationalization. His eyes continued to scan the highway ahead and to both sides, searching with increasing desperation for any sign of the truck that Marla Dean was supposedly broadcasting from. The vehicle that apparently both was and wasn't there, that existed in some state that defied simple present-tense description. "I don't think I'm anywhere, Dalton," Marla's voice said, and now it carried a quality of resignation mixed with something that might have been relief. "Or maybe I'm everywhere along this highway at once, spread out across distance and time in ways that don't make sense when you try to think about them using normal logic. I've been trying to remember when my truck broke down, trying to establish a clear timeline. But I keep finding gaps and inconsistencies. Memories that don't quite fit together. Details that contradict each other. And the more I examine those contradictions, the more I realize that maybe the breakdown happened a long time ago, and what I thought was tonight was actually years in the past, and I've been stuck here broadcasting on this frequency trying to reach someone who could help me understand what happened." Dalton's GPS showed him passing mile marker 342, which placed him approximately 18 miles north of Carlsbad, well into the heart of the search area where Marla Dean's truck should have been visible if it existed in any conventional sense. The highway remained empty, his headlights revealing nothing but pavement and desert and the occasional reflective marker post. No stopped vehicle, no stranded trucker, no physical evidence that anyone named Marla Dean had ever driven this route. Yet her voice continued to emerge from his CB speaker, clear and strong now, describing a situation that existed somewhere between transmission and reception, between call and answer. "I need to check something," Dalton said, his voice hoarse. He reached for his phone, grateful that this section of highway had cellular coverage, and opened a browser. His right hand stayed on the wheel, maintaining his southbound course, while his left hand awkwardly typed a search query that felt simultaneously absurd and necessary. Marla Dean Trucker, New Mexico. The results that appeared on his screen made his blood run cold, confirming suspicions that part of him had already begun to formulate. There, in a news article from 7 years earlier, was the story of a truck driver named Marla Dean, who had disappeared while hauling drilling equipment on Highway 285 between Roswell and Carlsbad. Her truck had been found abandoned, engine cold, no signs of accident or foul play, the driver simply gone as if she'd evaporated into the desert night. "Dalton?" Marla's voice said through the CB, and now it carried an edge of urgency that cut through his shock. "I can feel you understanding now, can sense your consciousness beginning to grasp what's really happening here. You're going to have a choice to make very soon, a choice about whether to keep driving or to stop and try to help me. I need you to understand something before you make that decision. I've been calling out on this frequency for 7 years, and in all that time, only a handful of drivers have been able to hear me. Most people's radios just skip right past my transmissions, treat them as static or interference. The fact that you can hear me, that we're having this conversation, means something about you is different. Something about your consciousness or perception is attuned to frequencies that most people can't access. And that difference, that ability, it makes you vulnerable to the same thing that happened to me." Dalton's mind was racing, trying to process impossible information, attempting to maintain some grip on rational understanding, even as everything he'd believed about the nature of reality was being systematically dismantled by a voice on a CB radio. He thought about turning around, about fleeing north away from Carlsbad and whatever zone of wrongness he was driving into. But professional instinct and simple human decency kept him moving forward, kept him listening to Marla Dean's impossible broadcast, trying to understand what had happened to her and what might be about to happen to him. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, and somewhere in the darkness, a truck sat abandoned with mysteries it would never fully reveal, broadcasting across time and distance, calling for help that couldn't come because the nature of the problem defied any solution that operated within normal rules of cause and effect. Dalton's truck continued its steady southbound progress while his mind struggled to process the contradiction between what Marla Dean was telling him and what the news article on his phone screen documented. According to the archived report, her truck had been discovered by a highway patrol officer conducting a routine patrol on a quiet Sunday morning, positioned on the shoulder approximately 15 miles north of Carlsbad. The article described the scene as puzzling rather than alarming. Engine off, but not damaged. Cargo secure and untouched. No signs of struggle or forced entry. Personal belongings still in the sleeper compartment, including her wallet and phone. Marla Dean herself had simply vanished, leaving behind a vehicle that offered no clues about what had prompted her to abandon it or where she might have gone afterward. The investigation had apparently continued for several weeks, involving local law enforcement, the state police, and eventually the FBI due to the possibility of interstate criminal activity. Search dogs had tracked Marla's scent from the truck about 200 yards into the desert before losing it completely, as if she'd ceased to exist at that precise point. Theories had ranged from voluntary disappearance to abduction, to the grim possibility that she'd wandered into the desert in a state of confusion and succumbed to the elements in an area where her body might never be recovered. The case had eventually gone cold, classified as a missing person incident with suspicious circumstances but no definitive evidence of crime or foul play. "You found the article, didn't you?" Marla's voice came through the CB speaker, not really a question, but a statement of fact. "I can feel your consciousness processing that information, trying to reconcile it with the fact that you're talking to me right now. It doesn't make sense using normal logic, I understand that. Dead people don't make CB radio calls. Missing persons don't broadcast their voices 7 years after disappearing. But Dalton, what if the categories we use to organize reality are too simple? What if dead and alive aren't the only options? What if there are states of being that exist between or outside those boundaries?" Dalton found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. "The article says they found your truck. It was empty, abandoned. If you're broadcasting from that truck right now, if what you're telling me is true, then where is it? I've been driving through the area where it should be, and there's nothing here, no stopped vehicle anywhere in sight." Even as he spoke, he was scanning both shoulders more desperately, looking for any shape that might resolve into a semi-truck when viewed from the correct angle or distance. The highway remained stubbornly empty, offering no physical evidence to support the impossible conversation he was having. "My truck exists in a different frequency than you're currently perceiving," Marla said, her voice taking on a tone that suggested she was working through understanding as she spoke, discovering truths about her situation even as she articulated them. "When my engine died that night 7 years ago, when everything went dark and I felt the world shift around me in ways I couldn't explain, I didn't just experience mechanical failure. I experienced some kind of dimensional displacement, a slippage between states of reality. The truck is still there, still sitting on that shoulder where the police found it, but it exists in a temporal pocket that's separated from the normal flow of time. I'm trapped in that moment, broadcasting outward, trying to reach someone who might understand what happened and help me escape." The explanation was simultaneously too fantastic to believe and oddly consistent with what Dalton was experiencing. He'd been driving for 12 years through these exact stretches of highway, had passed through the area where Marla Dean's truck had been found countless times without ever seeing anything unusual or feeling any particular sense of wrongness. But tonight, something was different. Some quality of the darkness, or his own receptivity, had allowed him to hear transmissions that existed outside normal radio frequencies, to communicate with consciousness trapped in conditions that defied straightforward description. He thought about Luther Cade and the stories other truckers sometimes told about impossible radio broadcasts and temporal anomalies, wondering if this was part of some larger pattern, if certain highways carried properties that made them prone to these kinds of disturbances. "If what you're saying is true," Dalton said carefully, "if you're trapped in some kind of temporal pocket, how am I supposed to help you? I don't understand the physics or metaphysics of what you're describing, don't have any tools or knowledge that would allow me to access a dimension I can't perceive or interact with normally." The admission felt like failure, even as he spoke it. Recognition that he was confronting a problem far beyond his capacity to solve. He was a truck driver, someone trained to operate heavy machinery and navigate highway systems, not equipped to deal with phenomena that existed outside conventional reality. Marla's response carried a quality of urgency that hadn't been present earlier, as if their conversation was approaching some kind of critical threshold. "You don't need special tools or knowledge, Dalton. You just need to be willing to stop. When you reach mile marker 337, I need you to pull over onto the shoulder, put your truck in park, and shut off your engine." That's the exact location where my truck is sitting in its displaced state, and if you occupy the same physical space while maintaining consciousness of both our frequencies, you might create a bridge between our realities. It's happened before, with one of the other drivers who could hear me, but he got scared at the last moment and drove away before the connection could stabilize. I've been waiting years for another opportunity, for someone else attuned enough to hear my broadcasts and brave enough to try to help. The request made Dalton's stomach clench with instinctive reluctance. Every professional instinct warned against stopping in a deserted location based on instructions from a voice that might be hallucination or manipulation, might be something far more dangerous than a simple, distressed call. Yet he found himself slowing slightly, his foot easing off the accelerator, his eyes searching for the mile marker that Marla had specified. His GPS showed him approaching that location within the next few minutes, and he realized he was actually going to do what she asked, was going to pull over and shut down his truck despite all the warnings screaming in his mind about the foolishness of such action. "Tell me exactly what happened the night you disappeared," Dalton said, needing more information before committing to a course of action that might be irrevocable. "What do you remember about the moments before your truck stopped working? Were there any unusual signs? Anything that might have warned you that something strange was about to happen?" The question served dual purposes: gathering practical information that might help him assess the situation, and delaying the moment when he would have to actually make the choice to stop or continue driving, to risk involvement or prioritize self-preservation. Marla's response came slowly, as if she was sorting through memories that had become jumbled or corrupted over time. "I remember feeling tired, more exhausted than usual despite having slept well before starting the drive. The kind of fatigue that settles into your bones and makes your eyes feel heavy no matter how much coffee you drink. I remember the radio acting strangely, cycling through stations on its own, catching fragments of broadcasts that didn't seem to match any actual programming. There was music I didn't recognize, voices speaking in patterns that sounded almost like language but weren't quite intelligible. And then there was a moment, just a fraction of a second, where everything went completely silent. Not just quiet, but absolutely silent in a way that felt wrong, like reality had been put on pause. The description triggered recognition in Dalton's memory, not of personal experience but of stories he'd heard from other drivers, accounts that circulated through the trucking community like folklore. Tales of dead zones where radio signals failed and engine sounds seemed muffled, of moments when time appeared to stretch or compress in uncomfortable ways. Most truckers dismissed these stories as exaggerations or misinterpretations of ordinary phenomena, fatigue and isolation creating the illusion of supernatural occurrence. But Dalton was beginning to understand that some of these accounts might have been accurate reports of genuine anomalies, experiences that the witnesses themselves struggled to accept or articulate because they violated fundamental assumptions about how reality operated. Mile marker 337 appeared in his headlights, the reflective numbers bright against the darkness, marking the location where Marla Dean wanted him to stop. Dalton felt his heart rate increase, adrenaline flooding his system as his body prepared for fight or flight responses to threat it couldn't clearly identify. His hands moved almost automatically, guiding his truck toward the shoulder, applying brakes with practiced smoothness. The Freightliner rolled to a stop in the exact position Marla had specified, engine idling, air brakes hissing their engagement. For several seconds, Dalton sat frozen, unable to take the final step of shutting down his engine, creating the conditions that Marla claimed would bridge their separate realities. "I'm here," Dalton said into his CB microphone, his voice tight with tension. "I'm stopped at mile marker 337. What happens now? What am I supposed to do?" The questions emerged almost against his will, overriding his paralysis with the need for clear instructions, for some framework that would make the next moments comprehensible even if not comfortable. His eyes scanned the darkness visible through his windows, looking for any change in the environment, any sign that his presence at this location was affecting the space around him in observable ways. Everything appeared normal, just empty desert and dark sky and his truck's lights creating a small bubble of illumination in the vast darkness. "Shut off your engine," Marla's voice instructed, carrying authority that suggested she knew exactly what needed to happen and in what sequence. "Turn off all your lights, your CB radio, everything electronic. You need to sit in complete darkness and silence for at least 3 minutes, allowing your consciousness to adjust to different sensory input." Most people's minds are so flooded with constant stimulation that they can't perceive subtle variations in reality, can't detect the frequencies where I'm broadcasting from. But if you eliminate all external input, if you force your consciousness to reach outward for something to focus on, you might start to perceive what's been here all along, hidden just outside normal awareness. Dalton's hand moved toward his ignition key, hesitated there for a moment as his rational mind made one final protest against the insanity of what he was about to do, and then turned the key. The engine rumbled into silence, taking with it the familiar vibration that was as much a part of truck driving as steering or shifting gears. He systematically shut down his lights, plunging the cab into darkness, then reached for his CB radio and flipped its power switch. The sudden absence of the background static that had been present throughout the entire conversation was almost shocking, creating a quality of silence that felt oppressive and unnatural. Dalton sat in absolute darkness, unable to see even vague shapes inside his own cab, the night outside providing no ambient light to offset the blackness. The first minute passed with excruciating slowness, each second distinct and heavy with significance. Dalton focused on his breathing, trying to keep it steady and controlled despite the fear crawling up his spine. His other senses seemed to sharpen in compensation for the loss of vision, hearing becoming more acute, detecting sounds he wouldn't normally notice. The slight creaking of his truck's frame as metal cooled, wind moving through the desert vegetation outside, his own heartbeat loud in his ears. He tried to measure time by counting seconds, but quickly lost track, uncertain whether he'd been sitting in darkness for 1 minute or several, awareness of duration becoming slippery and unreliable without external reference points. Something changed in the quality of the darkness, though Dalton couldn't immediately identify what the change consisted of. It wasn't that the blackness became less absolute, or that shapes began to resolve into visibility, but rather that the darkness itself acquired texture, became something more than simple absence of light. He found himself aware of depth and dimension that hadn't been present moments earlier, as if the space inside and immediately around his truck had expanded or revealed layers that normal perception filtered out. The sensation was disorienting and vaguely nauseating, similar to vertigo but operating on a more fundamental level, affecting his sense of where he was positioned in relation to the world around him. Then he heard it. A sound that shouldn't have been possible with all his electronics powered down. The crackle of a CB radio coming to life. Marla Dean's voice emerging not from his dashboard speaker, but from everywhere at once, from the air itself, or perhaps from inside his own head. "You're doing it, Dalton. You're beginning to perceive across frequencies. Keep your mind open. Don't let fear pull you back into your normal state of consciousness. I can almost see you now, almost reach across the gap between where you are and where I am. Just a little longer, just a little more willingness to let go of certainty about what's real and what's not." Dalton's eyes, which had been seeing nothing but blackness, began to detect light where none should exist. Faint at first, just the suggestion of illumination outlining shapes and forms, but growing gradually stronger and more defined. He could see the interior of his cab, but overlaid with something else. Another space occupying the same location, but existing in a different state. There were 2 steering wheels visible simultaneously, 2 dashboard displays, 2 driver's seats. His truck and another truck, present in the same physical space, but separated by some membrane of reality that was growing thinner, more permeable, as his consciousness adjusted to perceiving both frequencies at once. And then he saw her, Marla Dean, sitting in the driver's seat that existed in the space overlapping with his own, her face pale and drawn but unmistakably human, wearing an expression of desperate hope mixed with resignation. She looked solid and real, not ghostly or translucent, just a woman sitting in a truck cab that existed in a different layer of reality than his own. Their eyes met, and Dalton felt a jolt of connection, recognition that transcended normal communication. She mouthed words that he somehow understood despite the absence of sound. "Help me. Please, help me get out of here." Dalton reached toward her instinctively, his hand extending into the space where her reality overlapped with his. And for a moment he felt resistance, like pushing against a membrane or passing through heavy fabric. Then his hand penetrated the barrier and he could feel Marla's hand grasping his own, solid and warm and desperately strong. The physical contact created an immediate intensification of the overlap, both realities becoming more sharply defined and present. Dalton could see her truck clearly now, could see that it was indeed older and more weathered than it should be, showing 7 years of sitting exposed to desert conditions, despite being invisible to normal perception. "I can feel you," Marla said. Her voice no longer filtered through radio static but direct and clear, though still carrying a quality that suggested it was reaching him through unconventional means. "You're creating the bridge I needed, the connection between my trapped state and your active timeline. But Dalton, you need to understand something before you try to pull me through. Whatever happened to me that night, whatever caused me to become displaced from normal reality, there's a reason for it. There's something about this location, this specific point on the highway, that creates conditions where these dimensional pockets can form. And if you're not careful, if you don't maintain perfect focus on your own reality while helping me, you could become trapped here as well, stuck in the same temporal loop that's held me for 7 years." The warning should have made Dalton release her hand, should have triggered his survival instinct to pull back and flee before whatever had claimed Marla could claim him as well. But he found himself maintaining the contact, holding tight to her hand even as he felt strange forces pulling at his consciousness, trying to drag him deeper into the overlapped state. He could feel the temptation to let go, to sink into the temporal pocket where everything was frozen and unchanging, where the burden of normal time and causality no longer applied. It would be so easy to just stop resisting, to accept displacement as a form of escape from the exhaustion and pressure of maintaining continuous forward motion through life. "Stay with me, Dalton," Marla said urgently, seeming to sense his wavering focus. "Don't let it pull you in. You need to anchor yourself to your timeline, to your truck and your route and your life. Think about where you're supposed to be tomorrow, about deliveries you need to make and people who are expecting you. Use those connections to the normal flow of time as a lifeline, and then pull me along that lifeline back into reality." Her voice had taken on a coaching quality, guiding him through a process she'd apparently been thinking about for years during her imprisonment, waiting for someone who could hear her broadcasts and be brave enough to attempt rescue. Dalton focused his mind on concrete details: his delivery scheduled for Carlsbad in the morning, his dispatcher Otis Grange, who would be expecting a status update when he reached his destination, the routine of post-delivery paperwork, and the drive back to Albuquerque afterward. He visualized the entire sequence of normal professional activity, used it to anchor his consciousness firmly in his own timeline, and then, maintaining that anchor, he pulled on Marla's hand. The resistance was enormous, like trying to drag something through thick mud or heavy water, forces that didn't want to release what they'd captured. He pulled harder, using not just physical strength but willpower, the determination that had kept him driving through bad weather and difficult conditions for over a decade. Something gave way with an almost audible snap, and suddenly Marla was falling forward, passing through the membrane between realities, landing heavily against Dalton in the confined space of his truck's cab. The overlapped vision collapsed instantly, the doubled images resolving into singular perception. Marla Dean was no longer semi-transparent or existing in a parallel space. She was simply there, solid and present, breathing hard and clutching at Dalton's arm with both hands, as if afraid she might slip back into displacement if she lost contact with him. Her clothes were covered in dust, and her hair was tangled, but she looked fundamentally intact, alive in ways that transcended simple biological function. "Did it work?" Marla asked, her voice hoarse and uncertain. "Am I really here? Am I back in normal time?" The questions carried such desperate need for confirmation that Dalton found himself nodding before he'd fully processed what had happened. He reached for his ignition key, started his engine, hearing its familiar rumble with profound relief. The dashboard lights came on, illuminating Marla's face and confirming that she was indeed physically present, not hallucination or projection. His CB radio powered up automatically, immediately filling with normal Channel 19 chatter, truckers discussing traffic conditions and fuel prices with casual familiarity that felt miraculous after the strangeness of the past hour. Dalton grabbed his cell phone, checking the time and date to verify that his own timeline had remained stable during the rescue attempt. Everything appeared normal, his GPS showing his exact location, cellular signal strong, no indication that he'd experienced any temporal displacement himself. He looked at Marla, taking in her expression of stunned relief mixed with lingering confusion, and realized that the hard part wasn't necessarily over. He'd successfully pulled her out of whatever dimensional pocket had trapped her, but now they faced practical questions about what to do next, how to explain her reappearance after 7 years, whether she could simply resume the life she'd been displaced from, or if too much time had passed for normal reintegration. "We need to get you to authorities," Dalton said, his voice steadying as he shifted back into practical, problem-solving mode. "Police, medical professionals, people who can verify your identity and make sure you're healthy. There's going to be a lot of questions about where you've been for 7 years, what happened to you." I don't know how much we should tell them about the actual circumstances, whether they'd believe the truth, or if we need to create some kind of conventional explanation." Even as he spoke, he was putting his truck in gear, pulling back onto the highway, needing motion and progress to counteract the static wrongness of the past hour. Marla nodded slowly, seeming to process the implications of her situation. 7 years, she repeated quietly, testing the words. I lost 7 years sitting in that displaced state, experiencing the same moment over and over, broadcasting for help that almost never came. My family, my friends, they've been mourning me or searching for me or moving on with their lives without me. I don't even know if my mother is still alive, if my sister still lives in Hobbs, if anything about my old life still exists in a form I can return to. The enormity of what she'd lost was beginning to register in her expression, shock giving way to grief and disorientation. Dalton drove in silence for several minutes, giving Marla space to process while simultaneously trying to organize his own thoughts about what had happened and what it meant. The New Mexico darkness that had seemed so oppressive and threatening earlier now felt almost protective, a neutral backdrop against which extraordinary events could occur without judgment or interference. He thought about calling his dispatcher, trying to explain why he was going to be delayed in making his delivery, but the explanation would require details he couldn't share over a recorded company line. This was going to be complicated in ways he couldn't fully anticipate. Ripples spreading outward from this night affecting multiple timelines and multiple lives. "Thank you," Marla said suddenly, breaking the silence. "I don't know if I said that yet, but thank you for stopping, for listening to my broadcast, for being willing to reach across that barrier and pull me out. Most people would have kept driving, would have convinced themselves they were imagining things or experiencing equipment malfunction. You trusted something that defied rational explanation, and that trust saved me from an eternity of being trapped in frozen time. I won't forget that ever, regardless of what happens next." Dalton nodded, accepting her gratitude while recognizing that he'd simply done what felt necessary, what any decent human being should do when confronted with someone in genuine distress. But he also understood that he'd crossed a threshold tonight similar to the one Marla had been trapped beyond, had experienced something that fundamentally altered his understanding of reality's structure and possibilities. He could never drive Highway 285 again with the naive assumption that it was just asphalt and distance, just another route connecting point A to point B. He now knew that certain locations carried properties that transcended conventional physics, that consciousness could become displaced or trapped in ways that defied simple biological death, that time itself might be more fluid and negotiable than everyday experience suggested. The lights of Loving appeared ahead, the small community's illumination providing a destination, a waypoint where they could begin the process of bringing Marla Dean back into the world she'd been absent from for 7 years. Dalton took the exit, pulling into a convenience store parking lot, and reached for his phone to make the calls that would set official processes in motion. Before dialing, he looked at Marla one more time, seeing in her expression a mixture of relief, fear, determination, and something else that might have been understanding about the strangeness they'd both experienced and would carry with them forever. Whatever happened next, whatever explanations they provided, or truths they revealed or silences they maintained, this night would remain with both of them as a marker, a boundary between before and after, between the comfortable illusion that reality operated according to simple rules, and the more complex truth that highways could be haunted, that time could trap consciousness, that voices calling out on CB radio frequencies might be reaching across distances far stranger than mere physical space. The convenience store's fluorescent lights seemed aggressively bright after the darkness of the highway, creating harsh shadows and bleaching color from everything they touched. Dalton had pulled his truck into a space at the far end of the parking lot, away from the main entrance where curious eyes might notice the disheveled woman in his passenger seat and make assumptions that would complicate an already impossible situation. Marla sat motionless, staring at her hands as if they were foreign objects she was seeing for the first time, occasionally flexing her fingers or touching her face with tentative gestures that suggested she was still verifying her own physical existence. The 7 years she'd lost weren't visible on her body. She looked exactly as she must have the night she disappeared, but something in her expression carried the weight of time spent outside normal causality, an awareness that aged consciousness, if not flesh. Dalton's phone sat in his hand, the screen displaying emergency services contact information, but his thumb hovered over the call button without pressing it. He was trying to formulate an explanation that would make sense to dispatchers and responding officers, trying to find words that would convey the essential truth without straying into territory that would get him dismissed as disturbed or delusional. How do you tell authorities that you've rescued a missing person from a temporal displacement 7 years after her disappearance? How do you describe reaching across dimensional boundaries to pull someone back into normal reality without sounding like you've experienced a psychotic break or consumed substances that affected your judgment? "Maybe we shouldn't call them yet," Marla said quietly, her voice still carrying the hoarse quality of someone who'd been shouting or crying, though Dalton suspected it was actually the result of 7 years of disuse, vocal cords that had been frozen in time suddenly required to function again. "I know that sounds wrong. I know there are people who need to be notified that I'm alive, families who deserve closure, investigations that need to be updated. But Dalton, if we bring in authorities right now, if we try to explain what really happened, they're going to separate us. They're going to take me to a hospital for evaluation. They're going to question you for hours about how we met and what your involvement is in my reappearance. And once we're separated, once we're telling our stories to different people in different rooms, the truth is going to fragment into something that sounds like conspiracy or delusion." The logic was sound enough to give Dalton pause. He'd been thinking in terms of immediate obligation, the civic duty to report a missing person's return and ensure she received proper medical attention. But Marla was right that involving official channels would create complications neither of them was prepared to handle. His own timeline would come under scrutiny, GPS records and dispatch logs examined to determine if he could have been involved in her original disappearance, whether this was some elaborate scheme rather than genuine rescue. The questions would multiply faster than answers could be provided, and the true explanation would either be rejected as impossible or, worse, believed, and leading to consequences neither of them could predict. "What are you suggesting?" Dalton asked, recognizing that Marla had spent 7 years thinking about this moment, planning for possibilities that he was only beginning to consider. "That we don't report your return at all? That you just try to slip back into your old life as if nothing happened?" The idea seemed untenable even as he articulated it. Too many complications and too many people who would need explanations. But he found himself waiting for her response, curious about what plan she'd formulated during her long imprisonment, what vision of reintegration she'd been holding on to as motivation to keep broadcasting her distress calls. Marla turned to look at him directly, her eyes reflecting the parking lot lights in a way that made them seem to glow with internal illumination. "I'm suggesting that we take some time to figure out our story before we bring in outsiders who won't understand and won't believe. I need to know what happened to my life while I was gone. Need to understand if there's anything left to return to, or if 7 years has erased my previous existence so thoroughly that starting over might be easier than trying to reclaim what was lost. And you need to decide how much of the truth you're willing to testify to, how much risk you want to take by associating yourself with something that defies normal explanation." The weight of her words settled over Dalton like a physical burden. He'd already crossed the threshold by stopping his truck and reaching into the temporal pocket to rescue her, had already made himself complicit in whatever strange forces operated along that section of Highway 285. But there were degrees of involvement, and what Marla was proposing would deepen his connection to events that might attract attention he didn't want, from authorities or from other entities that had interest in dimensional anomalies and consciousness displacement. He thought about his daughter, about the relatively simple life he'd built around the reliable rhythms of long-haul trucking, about how all of that could be disrupted if he allowed himself to be drawn further into the mystery of what had happened to Marla Dean. "There's a truck stop about 15 miles south," Dalton said, making a decision that felt simultaneously right and terrifying. "Place called the Desert Rose, been there for decades, serves the oil field workers and truckers 24 hours. We can go there, get some food, use their internet to research what's happened in your life since you disappeared. Figure out our next steps in a neutral location where we're not likely to be disturbed or questioned." The plan was minimal, barely deserving the name, but it provided immediate direction and bought time for more careful consideration of complex problems. Marla nodded, seeming to find relief in having concrete action to focus on rather than the overwhelming abstraction of her situation. Dalton restarted his engine, pulled out of the convenience store parking lot, and merged back onto Highway 285 southbound. The drive to the Desert Rose would normally take less than 20 minutes, but Dalton found himself driving slowly, using the time to process everything that had happened and to prepare mentally for whatever revelations awaited when they began investigating Marla's lost years. The highway looked normal again, just asphalt and lane markings and the occasional vehicle passing in the opposite direction. No hint of the dimensional strangeness that had characterized the area around mile marker 337. "Can I ask you something?" Marla said, after several minutes of silence. "When you heard my voice on the CB, when I first started broadcasting my distress call, did you have any sense that something was wrong about it? Any intuition that this wasn't just a normal mechanical breakdown?" The question suggested she was trying to understand her own situation by examining how it appeared to outside perception, looking for clues about the nature of her displacement by studying the interface between her trapped state and normal reality. Dalton considered the question carefully, reviewing his memory of those first transmissions. "There was something off about it from the beginning," he admitted. "Nothing I could point to specifically at first, just a feeling that the conversation wasn't quite right, that details didn't add up the way they should. Your voice quality was wrong for someone broadcasting from a working CB radio. There was a strange echo or delay that didn't match normal transmission characteristics. And the content of what you were saying, the way you described your situation, it felt both too specific and too vague at the same time, like you were describing something you only partially understood yourself." Marla absorbed this information with visible concentration, as if each detail provided crucial insight into mechanisms she needed to comprehend. "I remember trying to make the distress calls in what I thought was real time, reporting my breakdown as if it had just happened. But I also remember a growing awareness that time wasn't working normally for me, that the present moment kept repeating or looping back on itself. Every time I thought hours had passed, I'd notice that nothing had actually changed, that the darkness outside my truck was exactly the same darkness, the sounds were the same sounds, my own physical state hadn't progressed. It was like being stuck in a single frame of film that kept playing over and over, consciousness trapped in an eternal now that couldn't move forward or backward." The description made Dalton's skin crawl with sympathetic horror. He tried to imagine experiencing that kind of temporal imprisonment, awareness functioning normally but reality frozen around you, unable to progress or escape or even properly sleep because sleep implied the passage of time. 7 years experiencing the same moment repeatedly would drive most people insane, Yet Marla seemed relatively intact psychologically, still capable of coherent thought and communication. That resilience suggested either extraordinary mental strength or that the displacement had affected her consciousness in ways that buffered her from the full psychological impact of eternal present tense. The Desert Rose truck stop appeared ahead, its distinctive red and white neon sign visible from over a mile away, a beacon of civilization in the empty desert night. Dalton pulled off the highway and into the sprawling parking lot, finding a space among the scattered trucks whose drivers were taking mandatory rest breaks or waiting for morning deliveries. The facility was aging but well-maintained, its restaurant section occupying one end of a long building that also housed showers, a small convenience store, and a driver's lounge with internet access and television. At this hour, approaching 4 in the morning, the restaurant would be sparsely populated, mostly insomniacs and night shift workers seeking coffee and conversation. They entered through the main door, Marla walking slightly behind Dalton, as if using him as a shield against the overwhelming normalcy of the environment. The restaurant's interior was classic truck stop aesthetic: vinyl booths and laminate tables, walls decorated with vintage trucking memorabilia and local landscape photography. A waitress looked up from the counter where she'd been refilling coffee for 2 men in oil field uniforms, her expression shifting through curiosity to professional welcome as she gestured toward empty booths. Dalton chose one near the back, away from the main flow of traffic, and they slid into seats across from each other. The waitress brought menus and coffee without being asked, a service instinct developed over years of reading customer needs. "Kitchen's got full menu available," she said, her accent carrying the distinctive rhythm of native New Mexicans. "Though, if you want the green chile stew, I'd recommend it. Cook made a fresh batch about an hour ago." She departed before either of them could respond, providing space for them to adjust to the environment and decide what they wanted. Marla picked up her coffee cup with both hands, holding it close to her face and inhaling the steam as if the aroma itself provided nourishment or confirmation of reality. Dalton pulled out his phone, opened a browser, and handed it to Marla. "Start with your own name," he suggested. "See what information is publicly available about your disappearance and what's happened since. It might be difficult to read, but you need to know what you're dealing with before we decide on next steps." Marla took the phone with trembling hands, typed her name into the search bar, and began scrolling through results. Dalton watched her face as she read, seeing emotions flash across her features too quickly to fully identify, grief and anger and confusion all mixing together. "There's a memorial page," Marla said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My family held a memorial service 6 months after I disappeared, when the investigation went cold, and they had to accept that I probably wasn't coming back alive. My mother wrote something about how proud she was of the person I'd become, how much she admired my independence and determination. Past tense, as if I was already dead." She continued scrolling, finding more articles, more references to her case, discussions in true crime forums speculating about what might have happened to her. Each discovery seemed to hit her like a physical blow, the accumulated weight of 7 years compressed into minutes of reading. Dalton ordered food when the waitress returned, choosing for both of them without consulting Marla, recognizing that she was too overwhelmed to make even simple decisions. The green chile stew arrived along with fresh tortillas and honey, comfort food appropriate for the early morning hours and the shock they were both processing. Marla ate mechanically, her attention remaining fixed on the phone screen, absorbing information about a life she'd been absent from for reasons no one had been able to determine. Dalton found himself eating without tasting, his own mind racing through implications and possibilities, trying to formulate plans that would account for variables he didn't fully understand. My mother died 2 years ago, Marla said suddenly, looking up from the phone with devastated eyes. Cancer. It was quick, according to the obituary, only a few months between diagnosis and death. The obituary lists me among her deceased children, says I predeceased her. She died thinking I was already gone, never knowing that I was trapped just outside reality, calling for help that couldn't reach her. The grief in her voice was raw and immediate. 7 years of potential mourning compressed into the moment of discovery, no time to process or prepare for the loss. Dalton reached across the table, placing his hand over Marla's in a gesture of comfort that felt inadequate but necessary. "I'm sorry," he said, the words carrying sincerity even as he recognized their insufficiency. "I can't imagine how much that hurts, learning about it this way, realizing you missed the chance to say goodbye or be there for her final months. But you can't blame yourself for that. You didn't choose to be displaced, didn't voluntarily abandon anyone. What happened to you was beyond your control." Marla nodded, but didn't seem entirely convinced by his reassurance. She continued searching, finding information about her sister, her friends, her former employer, all the threads of connection that had made up her life before the displacement. Some relationships had apparently persisted in her absence, friends maintaining hope that she might someday return, or at least that her fate might be discovered. Others had moved on, the natural attrition of time and distance eroding bonds that depended on active maintenance. Her job at Permian Transport had been filled by another driver. The company itself eventually sold to a larger carrier and absorbed into a bigger operational structure. The life she'd been living 7 years ago had continued without her, adapting to her absence, closing around the hole she'd left like water flowing around a removed stone. "There's a trust fund," Marla said, finding a detail that seemed to surprise her. Apparently, some trucking advocacy organization set up a fund to support search efforts for missing commercial drivers, and my case was one of the first they helped with. There's still money in it, earmarked for reward information or to support my family if I was ever found deceased. I wonder if that money could be used for living expenses while I figure out how to rebuild a life, or if accessing it would require revealing my identity in ways that would trigger all the official complications we're trying to avoid. The practical concern was a positive sign, suggesting Marla's mind was beginning to work beyond immediate shock and grief, starting to think about concrete survival needs. Dalton considered the problem, his own experience with administrative systems providing context. Accessing something like that would definitely require proof of identity and probably legal proceedings to establish that you're alive and eligible for the funds. But there might be other resources available that don't require as much documentation. Some churches and community organizations provide short-term assistance without asking too many questions, assuming you're willing to accept help with conditions of minimal privacy. They sat in silence for several minutes, both processing information and implications. The truck stop's ambient sounds providing background noise that was oddly comforting in its mundane familiarity. Other customers came and went, truckers grabbing quick meals before returning to their routes, oilfield workers ending or beginning shifts, all of them moving through their normal lives without awareness that two people in the back booth were dealing with impossible circumstances. The ordinariness of the environment created a strange contrast with the extraordinary nature of what Dalton and Marla were experiencing, highlighting how much strangeness could exist hidden within apparently normal space. "I need to make a decision," Marla said finally, her voice steadier now, carrying determination that hadn't been present earlier. "I can try to reclaim my old identity, go through all the official channels, submit to all the investigations and examinations and explanations that would be required. That path keeps me connected to my history, maintains continuity with the person I was before the displacement, but it also means years of complications and scrutiny, and possibly never being fully believed about what really happened. Or I can start over, create a new identity, build a new life from scratch, without the burden of trying to make sense of the missing years. That path is cleaner in some ways, but it means permanently severing ties with everyone I knew before, accepting that Marla Dean died the night her truck was found abandoned, and someone new emerged from that darkness. The choice she was articulating was profound and irreversible, regardless of which option she selected. Dalton found himself reluctant to offer advice, recognizing that this decision needed to come from Marla herself, needed to emerge from her own assessment of what she could handle and what kind of future she wanted to build. He'd already played his role by hearing her broadcasts and pulling her back into normal reality. Any further involvement risked imposing his own values and priorities on situations he couldn't fully understand. Yet, he also recognized that his silence might be interpreted as abandonment, that Marla needed some validation or support even if not explicit direction. "I can't tell you which choice is right," Dalton said carefully. "Both paths have validity. Both would require tremendous courage and commitment, but I can tell you this, whatever you decide, you don't have to do it completely alone. There are people who understand what happened to you, or at least understand that there are genuine mysteries operating on these highways that defy conventional explanation. Networks of drivers and support staff who've experienced their own anomalies or helped others who have. If you want, I can put you in contact with some of those people, create connections that might help regardless of which path you choose." The offer seemed to provide Marla with something she'd been needing, evidence that her experience, while rare and strange, wasn't entirely unique, that there was community available for those who'd crossed certain thresholds. Her expression shifted, some of the desperate isolation easing as she processed the implications of not being completely alone in understanding what highways could do to consciousness and time. She nodded slowly, accepting the offer as both practical assistance and emotional support, recognition that whatever came next would be easier with help than attempting to navigate it in complete isolation. Dalton thought about the card in his wallet, the one a waitress named Marlene had given him years ago after his own experience with temporal anomalies on an Arizona highway. He'd never called the number, had convinced himself that what he'd experienced was best left unexamined. But he'd kept the card, some part of him recognizing that he might someday need the connections it represented. He pulled out his wallet, found the card, and slid it across the table to Marla. "Call this number when you're ready," he said. "Tell whoever answers that Dalton Rigsby sent you, that you're someone who got displaced and needs help reintegrating. They'll know what that means, and they'll provide whatever assistance they can." Marla took the card, studying it with intensity disproportionate to its simple appearance, white cardstock with nothing but a phone number printed in plain font. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything. For hearing me when almost no one else could, for stopping when you could have just kept driving, for pulling me back when it would have been safer to leave me trapped, and for this, for connecting me to people who might understand. I won't forget what you did for me tonight. Won't forget that you were willing to risk your own safety and sanity to help someone you'd never met." The gratitude made Dalton uncomfortable in ways he couldn't fully articulate, highlighting the magnitude of what they'd experienced while simultaneously trivializing it through conventional expressions of thanks. He nodded acknowledgement, but shifted the conversation toward more immediate practical concerns. "Where do you want to go from here? Do you need a ride somewhere specific, or do you need time to figure out your next destination?" The question opened space for Marla to articulate needs that might not have been obvious to either of them. Marla considered for a long moment, her eyes distant as if consulting internal maps or decision trees that only she could see. "I think I need to go to Hobbs," she said finally. "That's where I lived before the displacement, where my sister still lives according to what I found online. I'm not ready to reveal myself to her yet, not ready for the emotional intensity of that reunion, but I need to see the place again, need to confirm that it still exists and that my memories of it are accurate. Maybe being physically present in locations that were important to me before will help me decide whether I'm trying to reclaim that life or saying goodbye to it permanently." The logic was sound enough, and Hobbs was only about 40 miles east of their current location, easily reached within an hour, even accounting for the indirect route required by highway configurations. Dalton could make the detour without seriously impacting his own delivery schedule, though he'd need to call his dispatcher, Otis Grange, at some point to explain the delay and possibly revise his arrival estimates. The complications were mounting, but still manageable, as long as they avoided official entanglements that would require extensive explanation and documentation. He paid for their meal, leaving cash to avoid creating electronic records that might later be questioned, and they returned to his truck. The drive to Hobbs passed in relative silence, both of them lost in private thoughts, processing the night's events from their different perspectives. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, pre-dawn gray replacing the absolute darkness that had characterized most of the night. Dalton found himself feeling the exhaustion that came from prolonged stress rather than simple sleep deprivation, a bone-deep tiredness that no amount of coffee could fully address. But he kept driving, maintained focus on the immediate task of navigation and vehicle operation, using professional discipline to override his body's desire to rest. Hobbs appeared gradually, a sprawl of development serving the oil and gas industry that dominated southeastern New Mexico's economy. Marla directed him through streets that looked familiar to her despite 7 years of absence, pointing out landmarks and noting changes, a coffee shop that had closed, a new apartment complex that hadn't existed before her displacement. They ended up in a modest residential neighborhood, houses built in the decades after World War II, now showing their age but still maintained with obvious care. Marla indicated a particular house, pale blue with white trim, a small front yard landscaped with drought-resistant plants. "That's where my sister lives," Marla said, her voice tight with emotion. "Or lived, as of a few years ago according to property records I found online. I can see lights on inside. Someone's awake. Maybe she's getting ready for work. Or maybe she never sleeps well. Maybe my disappearance affected her in ways that persist all these years later. I want to go knock on that door. Want to tell her I'm alive and back, and so sorry for everything she's been through. But I also know that showing up would destroy whatever peace she's managed to find, would force her to process impossible information and make decisions about whether to believe me or conclude I'm some kind of cruel imposter." Dalton understood the paralysis of conflicting impulses, the way desire for connection could be simultaneously overwhelming and terrifying. He didn't try to resolve Marla's dilemma, didn't offer platitudes about family bonds or the importance of truth. Instead, he simply sat with her in the gradually lightening dawn, providing presence without pressure, allowing her to work through her own thinking at whatever pace she needed. They watched the house for perhaps 20 minutes, seeing lights move from room to room as someone went through morning routines, completely unaware of being observed. Eventually, Marla made a small sound, half sob and half laugh, and shook her head. "I'm not ready," she said. "I thought being here would help me decide, would make the choice obvious one way or another. But I'm just not ready to face her yet. Maybe someday, after I've had time to process everything and figure out who I am now versus who I was before. But not today. Not like this." showing up disheveled and traumatized with a stranger and no way to adequately explain what happened. She turned away from the window, deliberately breaking her surveillance of the house, choosing to leave without making contact. Dalton started his engine and pulled away from the curb, leaving the neighborhood behind, giving Marla space and distance from the temptation to make impulsive decisions she might regret. He drove aimlessly for several minutes, allowing the motion and changing scenery to provide transition from the charged emotional moment. Eventually, he found himself on the highway heading west, back toward the route that would take him to his original destination in Carlsbad, and then on to other deliveries and other roads. Marla seemed content with this direction, not requesting specific destination, but accepting wherever the journey took her. "What are you going to do?" Marla asked after a long silence. "About what you experienced tonight, about the knowledge you now have regarding what can happen on these highways. Are you going to keep driving the same routes, keep taking the risk of encountering other anomalies, or will you change your patterns to avoid areas where displacement might occur?" The question suggested she was thinking about his well-being beyond the immediate crisis, considering the longer-term impacts of his involvement in her rescue. Dalton had been asking himself similar questions, though without formulating clear answers. "I don't know if avoiding specific routes would actually reduce the risk," he said slowly, working through his thinking as he spoke. "The displacement happened to you on Highway 285, but I encountered my own temporal anomalies on Interstate 40 in Arizona years ago. Other drivers report experiences on different highways in different states, no obvious geographic pattern that would allow meaningful prediction or avoidance. It seems like the vulnerability might be more about individual consciousness than specific locations. Some people attuned to perceive or interact with these dimensional pockets in ways that others aren't. If that's true, then changing routes wouldn't help. I'd just be encountering the same risks in different settings." The analysis was logical but also fatalistic, suggesting that once someone crossed certain thresholds of awareness, they remained permanently vulnerable to experiences that existed outside normal causality. Marla nodded, seeming to recognize truth in what he was describing. "That matches what I've come to understand about my own situation," she said. "The displacement didn't happen because I did something wrong or went somewhere dangerous. It happened because I was somehow receptive to it, tuned to frequencies that most people filter out without even realizing they exist. And that receptivity, that openness to experiencing reality in non-standard ways, I don't think it goes away just because you want it to. Once you know that time can trap consciousness, once you've felt the membrane between different dimensional states, you can't unknow those things or pretend the world is simpler than it actually is." They drove in contemplative silence for another hour, the sun fully risen now, transforming the desert landscape from monochromatic darkness to brilliant color, reds and oranges and deep browns that seemed to glow with internal fire. Dalton's fatigue was becoming harder to ignore, his reaction time slowing slightly, vision occasionally blurring in ways that suggested he needed rest soon. He pulled into a rest area, parking in a space designated for commercial vehicles, and shut down his engine. "I need to sleep for a few hours," he said to Marla. "You're welcome to stay here in the truck, use the sleeper berth if you want to rest as well, or you can take the card I gave you and make whatever calls you need to make to start figuring out your next steps." Marla looked at him with an expression that mixed gratitude and uncertainty. "I think I need to be alone for a while," she said quietly. "Not because I don't appreciate everything you've done, but because I need space to process without feeling like I'm performing my reactions for an audience. I'm going to call that number, see what kind of help is available, maybe start the process of building whatever comes next. But I should do that away from you, so you're not any more implicated in my situation than you already are. You've already taken enough risk by helping me. I don't want to expose you to additional complications." The decision to separate made practical sense, even as it felt emotionally abrupt, as if the intensity of their shared experience required more extensive denouement than simply parting ways at a rest area. But Dalton recognized that Marla was right, that continuing to travel together would create complications for both of them, binding their stories together in ways that might limit options later. He nodded acceptance, watched as Marla gathered the few items she'd accumulated during the night, the card with the phone number and a jacket he'd lent her when she'd been shivering. They stood outside his truck for a moment, awkward in the morning light, trying to find words adequate to mark what they'd experienced together. "Good luck," Dalton said finally, the phrase inadequate but sincere. "Whatever you decide about your identity and your future, I hope you find peace with it. You survived something that would have destroyed most people, and that survival says something important about your strength and resilience. Don't forget that when things get difficult, when you're questioning your choices or feeling overwhelmed by what you've lost, you made it through 7 years of temporal imprisonment with your mind intact. You can make it through whatever comes next." Marla smiled, the expression sad but genuine. "Thank you for seeing me," she said, the words carrying layers of meaning beyond their surface simplicity. "For hearing my broadcast when almost no one else could, for believing me when belief required accepting impossible things, for pulling me back into reality when it would have been safer to just keep driving. You gave me a second chance at existence, and I won't waste that gift." She turned and walked away before either of them could say anything else, heading toward the rest area's main building, moving with determined purpose that suggested she'd already begun making plans. Dalton watched her go, then climbed back into his truck and made his way to the sleeper berth. He set an alarm for 3 hours, barely adequate rest but enough to restore basic function, and lay down on the narrow bunk. Sleep claimed him almost immediately, pulling him under into dreams that mixed memory and imagination, conversations with voices on CB radios, hands reaching across dimensional barriers, highways that stretched into forever while simultaneously looping back on themselves. He woke to his alarm feeling gritty-eyed and disoriented, the events of the night already taking on the quality of dream or hallucination, details that had seemed vivid and concrete now feeling uncertain and negotiable. He checked his phone, finding a text message from an unknown number. Made the call. Help is coming. Thank you for everything. Maybe our paths cross again someday, M. The message provided closure of a sort, confirmation that Marla had successfully made contact with whatever network the phone number connected to, that she was being integrated into support systems that could help her navigate the impossible situation. Dalton saved the number, recognizing that he might need to reach out himself someday, that his own experiences with temporal anomalies might eventually require assistance beyond what his normal resources could provide. He contacted his dispatcher, Otis Grange, explaining his delay with vague references to equipment checks and mandatory rest periods, receiving mildly annoyed but ultimately accepting responses about revised delivery schedules. The lie sat uncomfortably, but telling the truth would have been worse, would have opened doors to questions and scrutiny that he had no desire to invite. He started his truck, pulled back onto the highway, and continued toward Carlsbad with his original cargo, resuming the professional rhythms that had defined his life for over a decade. But something had changed permanently, and Dalton knew it. He'd crossed a threshold by stopping at mile marker 337, by reaching into temporal displacement to rescue Marla Dean, by accepting that reality operated according to principles more complex and strange than conventional wisdom acknowledged. He could never again drive Highway 285 without awareness of what had happened there, without wondering if other displaced consciousnesses were broadcasting on frequencies most people couldn't hear, calling for help that rarely came. Every time his CB radio crackled with static or carried transmissions that seemed slightly wrong, he would wonder if he was hearing echoes of temporal imprisonment, voices calling across dimensions for rescue that might or might not be possible. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and terrible, and utterly indifferent to human concerns. Highways carved through it like scars, imposing human order on landscape that predated civilization by geological epochs. And somewhere in the space between the physical road and the metaphysical concept of journey, between the asphalt that carried traffic and the consciousness that experienced travel, mysteries operated according to their own logic, trapping and releasing, calling and answering, creating stories that would never be fully understood or adequately explained. Dalton was part of those stories now, whether he wanted to be or not, marked by his experience in ways that would shape the rest of his life. He drove on through the New Mexico morning, sun climbing higher, traffic increasing as the world awakened to another day of commerce and movement. Just another trucker hauling freight across America's highways, invisible in his ordinariness, carrying secrets that would sound like madness if spoken aloud. The road continued to unspool ahead of him, mile after mile, destination after destination, each one bringing him closer to completion of current obligations, while simultaneously opening possibilities for new journeys, new encounters with the strange forces that inhabited the liminal spaces between ordinary and extraordinary. Behind him, somewhere in the vast desert landscape, Marla Dean was beginning the process of rebuilding existence from fragments of lost time, creating new identity or reclaiming old, making choices that would ripple forward through whatever years remained to her. And on Highway 285, at mile marker 337, the space where Marla's truck had sat abandoned for 7 years remained charged with residual energy, a thin place where dimensional boundaries grew permeable under the right conditions, waiting for the next consciousness receptive enough to perceive what existed just outside normal awareness, waiting for the next voice to call out on frequencies that most people never heard, waiting for the next impossible rescue or the next permanent displacement. The endless cycle of highways haunted by mysteries that refused simple explanation or comfortable resolution. Dalton's CB radio crackled with standard Channel 19 chatter, truckers discussing traffic and weather and the small dramas of life on the road, voices grounding him in the present moment while his mind continued to process the night's impossible events. He added his own transmissions occasionally, maintaining connection to the community of drivers who shared these highways, but he found himself listening more carefully now, paying attention to subtle wrongness in transmissions, to voices that seemed to come from nowhere, to calls for help that might be reaching across distances more strange than mere physical miles. He'd become one of the listeners, one of the rare people who could hear when reality grew thin and consciousness leaked through into frequencies it shouldn't occupy. It was a burden and a responsibility, knowledge that couldn't be forgotten or ignored, awareness that would define the rest of his driving career and possibly the rest of his life. The highway stretched ahead and Dalton followed it, carrying his cargo and his secrets westward into the day.